There, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws. Today, we are finishing the Spirit of the Laws. We're looking at Book 31. Now, what's so interesting about Book 31 is, well, you said, but Book 31 has a very weird title. Isn't it similar, almost identical to the title of what was before? And I go, yeah. Where is it? What's everything? Let me go look at my hard book in front of me. The last chapter was the theory of the feudal laws, right, among the Franks and their relation to the establishment of their monarchy. So, about the establishment of their monarchy. Here is the theory of the feudal laws among the Franks and their relation to their revolutions, changes to their monarchy. So, therefore, the first part, we talked about the origins of the monarchy, the creation of their monarchy, how these things led to the creation. This chapter will look at the changes to their monarchy. So let's do it this way. We get it right here. Let's see how this works. Because we do it bigger, you get smaller, you get bigger, right? So you can see my hands a little bit, talking hands, right? Okay. So therefore, we're going to look at the revolution. This is a lot. This is technically has more chapters than the thing last one, and last one was like a semi monster in the sense that it was as bad as Book 28, which was Book 28 was a long one. We went almost 4 hours, so 4 hours. Oh my God! Reading it through. This is that was 45 chapters. Well, not yesterday's, but the previous one, Book 30, was only 25, but almost 4 hours. Also, because there was lot of huge chapter discussion areas. Um, Today is 34, so we're looking is oh my God, but there's a lot less. There's like only like 2 or 3 big chapters compared to the other ones like 5 or 6 or 7. So let's go look through what the structure of this, and let's hope we can get done in not as long as last time, but we'll fit in. But we're finishing up. This is the last part. This is the ending of the Spirit of the Laws in that sense. One of the things we have to pay attention to is, again, remember that book part 5 is all about we see the focus, except for the middle book of chapter 29. This has all been a kind of preparation for the question of looking at the French monarchy, the French king, the Entente regime. The focus of this, why the Franks and actually but also that explains the development. He's trying to give a good argument not only for the French, but the Continental, even the Germans. Why the Germans are up to before this point. Why the Germans are the way they are. So this is about the European political scene, the way the German tribes, the interface between the Roman collapse of the Roman Empire, the introduction of the Germanic peoples conquering the Roman Empire, and their reformulation, the interplay of these two factors, the interplay between German customs and mores to Roman laws, and the different German tribes, tribes that took parts of Europe differently in different directions, the Visigoths, the Vandals, and the Franks, the Burgundians. All these will shape differently. They will react and change differently. But again, they follow the habits. A Germanic tribe will behave certain way and have certain mores, and it lead to the changes of certain things of this in the medieval world, right? The creation of the medieval world, which then creates the establishment of the Frankish kingdom, right? The Frankreich. Germans say Frankreich, the French kingdom, right? So the France. So let's go through here and oh my God, why aren't you more centered? You're gonna say, okay, I'm more centered. Hold on. Get your water and let's go. Chapter 1. Changes in the offices and the fiefs. Okay, fiefs are these. What are fiefs? Remember again, fiefs are these. They're basically grants of territory, land, for obligations to the a king, the person who gave it to you, the prince or the entity that gave it to you. A fief is therefore like usually given to originally he said he talked about that in the Germanic tribes. They had the king, the princes had followers. These followers or companions who achieved accomplishments for that were rewarded by the princes with lands and territories that they were usually responsible to the king for or the prince for. And this is the purpose of a fief. Fief is that this kind of I give you tribute, I give you not necessarily money, but maybe duties and services for this, and other people that and therefore office. So the offices are the various duty structures that the prince has in order to accomplish things. Right. At first, counts were sent to their districts only for a year. They soon bought the continuation of their offices. As an example of this is found as early as the reign of Clovis and grandchildren. So therefore, the idea that the counts, original counts, the counts who were in charge of the counties, right, were office originally. Okay, the office carried responsibility, and it meant governing the things. It led the troops. It led the freemen into war. Um, Now, the responsibility here then is what? Account was responsible for, as the last book we looked at, the counts were responsible for dealing with the king's justice or the prince's justice in the territory. And there was money to it, right? There was money gained because of the product of the loss of the way justice was done by the Germanic tribes, the Germanic system of justice, which was fiscal more than kind of a capital, right? A certain Pionus was the count of the town of Auxerre. He sent his son Mumulus to Guntram with silver, in order that he would be continued in Guntram's employ. The son gave the silver on his own behalf and obtains his father's place. The kings had already begun to corrupt their own favors. In other words, what was originally done for favors, in other words, I mean, really, the original offices was there were favors for the faithful. In other words, these were your retainers. These were your people who were your favorites. These were the people who did you things, and you gave favors. The fiefs were favors in that sense. The offices were even favors for those who did good service for you, right? And that they, and that as long as they did continued service, you would reward them with that. But now what happened was all of a sudden people said, no, 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 I want to keep it, and here's a bribe for me to keep it. So therefore, this is the corruption of their own favors. Um, though by law of the kingdom feasts were revocable, nevertheless they were neither given nor taken away capriciously and arbitrarily. And this was usually one. Okay. Why is this doing this? Hold on, something's wrong here. Okay. One of the principal topics considered in the assemblies of the nations. Remember, the German kings were never like arbitrary rulers, like being their tribal kings, tribal leaders. They were never arbitrary rulers like the Persian satrap, the leader of the Persian Empire, or the Ottoman or Turk, as he says here, or some of despotic rulers. Okay, they he mentioned that they often acted in political things, acted in assemblies, okay, of the leaders of that. Even the count, when he operated in a certain way, exercised justice, did not always act like a single person. In other words, even the Lord who acted like this never really acted. The Germanic system was had a situation of assemblies, right? So the principal top. So therefore, the question of offices, even though it was kind of seen as In other words, it wasn't something capricious. In other words, titles were revocable. They were neither given away, neither taken away. They were neither given or taken away capriciously and arbitrarily, right? So it wasn't like this. And were usually one of the principal topics considered in the examination. One can readily think that the corruption crept in on this point, and it crept in on the other, and one continued to the possession of fiefs in exchange for silver, just as one continued one's possession of the counties. So therefore, the possession of the fief, the office and title, and and then also possession of the counties, which means possession and control of the revenue, anything that was generated out of that. Right? Of course, the king would have to get something for it. So therefore, this is how this would work. Right? This is. I will show in this book, and hold on, let's go look at footnote. This is footnote 2, chapter 7, right? That independently of the gifts princes made for a limited time, there were others they made for all time. So therefore, some gifts were given for a short time, like the position of count, but some gifts were given for a long time. It sometimes happened that the court wanted to revoke gifts that had been made. This set up a general discontent in the nation, and soon saw that it from it. One soon saw arise from it that revolution famous in the history of France, whose first period introduced the astonishing spectacle of the punishment of Brunhilde. In other words, this is the first revolution. This is the first change, right? This is the first change. In other words, a discontent, and now see the court demanded that something be given away, taken back, a gift be taken back, and then all of a sudden this got so angry. Now that this is the astonishment spectacle of the punishment of Brunhilde, it appears at first it appears extraordinary that this queen, daughter, sister, and mother of so many kings, who is famous even today for works worthy of a Roman ideal. And I think this is a advisor, if I remember correctly. I'm sorry. Okay, maybe go look at the dictionary. It's a Roman magistrate responsible for public buildings and public games, right? The ideal. This is the again. This is the purpose of this. The ideal is a classical Roman officer. So she is as Brunhilde. Brunhilde, right? We think of Brunhilde as something different, but in history, the image of her is that she's a German queen, a queen of the Frank, who was like, or a proconsul, right? She said, who was born with a remarkable genius for affairs and was endowed with qualities which had so long been respected, should suddenly have found herself exposed to such long, shameful, and cruel punishment. Again, this is Frederick Corner. This is reported there. By a king whose authority in his nation was quite purely consolidated. This is Clovis, right? This is again referring to Clovis too, son of Chirofect, father of Dagberg, right? Unless for some particular cause she had fallen into disgrace with the nation. Clotaire reproached her with the death of 10 kings, but two of them he himself had put to death. The death of certain others was the crime of fate, or that of the wickedness of another queen. And a nation which had let Fergrund die in her bed, that let Fred, okay, Frieddig, I can't, Frieddig die in her bed, which had even opposed punishing her dreadful crimes. Again, 6. This is Gregor Tibur, is now Friedrich Goethe. He says, he was vicious and unreasonable with some people, drawing so much into the treasury as snatching away people's possession as to fill treasury. Thus, no one would be able to acquire dignity which he had grabbed or had taken away from him. Right. This is that line for that. In other words, he had proposed their punishable crimes. He must have been very cool about those of Brunhilde, right? In other words, that her die in her bed must be very cool about those who did this. So therefore, this is in other words, clear reproach the death of 10 kings. That's not true that she did it, and that a nation which had let uh, 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 die in her bed. Okay. Had even which even had opposed punishing her dead for crimes. In other words, they must have been. In other words, they let her die in her bed and opposed her being punished for crimes. Right. This one be punished, not be punished, but this one, okay, we're going to be. They want to punish her in that sense. This is something happened. This person who is this punishment of Brunhilde. Right. She was put on a camel. She was put on a camel and paraded through the whole army. A sure mark of her having fallen into disgrace with the army. Frederick says that Pontus, a favorite of Brunhilde, took goods from the lords and filled the fisc with them. That he humbled the nobility, and that no one could be sure of keeping the position they had. Right. This is that. And this is where I was reading that line here, that he had, vicious, unreasonable with some people, drawing in much in the treasury, possessing the stank in people's possessions as to fill treasury. No one would acquire the dignity which he grabbed or taken away from him. Right. Um, the army conspired against him. He was stabbed in his tent, and because of the vengeance she took for his death, or because she followed the same plan, Brunhilde became daily more odious to the nation. Cohler, ambitious to reign alone, and filled with the most awful vengeance, sure of perishing if Brunhilde's children gained the upper hand, entered into a conspiracy in spite of himself. And whether he was incompetent or forced by circumstances, he became Brunhilde's accuser and made a frightful example of the queen. Warszawar had been the soul of the plot against Brunhilde, right? This person had been the person who was responsible for the plot. He was made mayor of Burgundy. He exacted from Clotaire that he would not be displaced during his life. When Clotaire had sworn that he would never degrade, which means dispose him, in his lifetime. In this way, the mayor could no longer be in the situation. In other words, in this way, the mayor could no longer be in the situation of the French lords, and his authority began to make itself independent of the royal authority. In other words, he was never going to be done. He's going to the fatal regnery of Brunhilde had especially arranged the nation. While the laws continued in force, no one could complain that a fief had been taken away from him, for the law did not give it to him forever. But when fiefs were given by avarice, bad practices, and corruption, one complained of being derived wrongly of that which had been acquired by the same way. Right? So perhaps if the public good had been the motive for the revocation of the gifts, nothing would have been said. But one displayed order without having hiding. In other words, but one displayed order without hiding the corruption. One claimed the right of the fisc only to waste the goods of the fisc according to one's fancies. Gifts were no longer either for reward, either the reward for or the expectation of service, right? So therefore, this was no longer going to be an aspect of service in that sense. Brumhilda, her spirit corrupt, Um, okay, this is why she's negative in that sense. Wanted to correct the abuses of the old corruption, right? Wanted the money back, right? So let's go back over here for a second. I want to get this right. Yeah, no, she was, she's all these nice things said about her, but then she's a corrupt person, right? Her spirit was corrupt. Wanted to correct the abuses of the old corruption, right? This giving of things for life. Her caprices were not those of a weak spirit, okay? The lords and the great officers believed themselves ruined. They brought about her ruin. So therefore, what happened was people, like I said, they were angry at they did this. We've gave you money for this. Why are you taking this away, right? And therefore they acted against her, right? We are far from having all the acts that were passed in those times. Now, we are far from having all the acts that were passed in those times. And the chroniclers, who knew of their time more or less what villagers know today of ours, have little to offer. So the chronicles, like he says, we don't have enough. We don't have enough information. He's saying here, this paragraph. We have this paragraph. He's saying, and by the way, the chroniclers of this are as knowledgeable as what the villages know more or less what villagers know today of our times, right? Words. Go to a village in this 18th, 17th, 18th century. What do you know? What's going on in our history? The Chronicles. He's making fun of the Chronicles in that sense, right? So we don't really have good information at the time. He said. However, we have the Constitution of Clotaire given in the Council of Paris to reform abuses, right? So this is 11 and 12. Before it happens that God asperses by violence those things which were done and arranged contrary to reasonable order, we ordain Christ willing that by this edict to amend this course of things in a general way. So therefore, this is reform abuses, right? Given Council in Paris, the reform abuses, which shows that this prince put an end to the complaints that had given rise to the revolution, right, against Brumhilda in that sense, right? On the one hand, it confirms that, and it confirms in it that all the gifts that had been made or confirmed by the kings, his predecessors, right? Everything is ambitious. And on the other, he orders that all that had been taken away from his lords or faithful should be returned to them, right? This is so therefore he's going to reaffirm what was given before his predecessors, and he then gives an order that everything should be returned, right? This is 14. This was not the only concession the king made in this council. He wanted what had been done against the privilege of the ecclesiastics to be corrected. Okay, 115, right? um, uh, 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 this this which for a time had been overlooked, henceforth continually inspected. Right. Um, he moderated the influence of the court in the election of bishoprics. 16. A bid. Right? When a bishop retires, one chosen in his place ought to be appointed by the metropolitan along with the inhabitants of the province. So therefore, the metropolitan and the inhabitants of the province. He should be chosen by the clergy and the people. If he be a worthy person, he should be ordained by the prince, or if chosen, if or if indeed he be chosen from the palace, he will be ordained on account of his personal leanings and merit. So this question of this the bishoprics. Um, uh, the king similarly reformed the business of the fisc, the financial aspects of this, the ties to treasure, right? He wanted all the new census removed. In other words, the 17, this is where the new census had been added in an impious manner, it will be amended, right? And and no toll, a rite of passage, right? Right to passage, no toll levied, uh, um, right to passage, a toll levied that had been established after the death of Guntrab's Siegebert and Clileflet. 18. Yeah. Again, this is just the site where that's from. That is, he abolished all that had been done during the regencies of Fredegund and Brunhilde. He prohibited his men from leading his herds into forests belonging to an individual. Um, Again, this is like you can't go and his herds cannot be done to an individual. And we shall see shortly that the reform was still more widespread and extended to the civil business. So therefore, this long passage. Now, so therefore he deals with this idea of the introduction of the fiefs and offices and fiefs. Right? This is the reform. He gives explaining why it happened, the corruption of the regencies, of these two women regencies. Now, chapter 2, how the civil government was reformed. Before the nation had shown signs of impatience and of flightlessness in the choice and conduct of its master. One okay, uh, make sure that no more sounds, alarms. Da da da. Okay, ready? Um, okay, let's repeat this. Sorry, I got interrupted. But it says one had, in other words, before one had shown the impatience choice in their choice conduct of masters, one had seen it rule on difference between its masters and its impose on them a necessary peace. So therefore, before there was a problem about the conduct of their masters, one had seen it rule on the differences between their masters and impose upon them a necessary peace. Stopping. But the nation then did what had not been seen before. It looked over its present situation. It examined it coolly, not passionately, not angrily, but coolly. It provided for their deficiency. It checked their violence. It regulated power. So therefore, he's simply saying here, the nation, before the nation had shown signs of the nation itself. This is very interesting. He speaks of the people, the larger thing, the nation. They had showed sign of impatience and fightness in the choice and the conduct of their rulers. Right? Remember, the lords and the populations were kind of angry at what happened to the rulers. Right? One had seen it rule on difference between its masters. In other words, it impose on them the fights between them, the two different things that they impose on them a necessary peace. But what the nation did now, he's saying, it looked over the present situation, it examined the laws coolly, it provided for their efficiency, it checked their violence and regulated power. So in other words, it's very interesting. He says, this is actually interesting that it says 5 things. 1, coolly. 4 things. It examined the laws coolly. It provided for their deficiencies. In other words, they addressed their deficiencies, checked violence, and it regulated power. The masculine, bold, and insolvent regencies, the masculine, bold, and insolvent regencies of Fredegund and Brunhilde had less stunned the nation than warned it. In other words, Frundegild had defended her wickedness by wickedness itself. She had vindicated poison. Vindicated is by vindicated. The French word is justified. We common translates vindicate, but here the relation to just reminds of the retaliatory. Okay, so she had justified poison. Justified or vindicated here. That's weird. Just to justified poison and her murders by poison and murders. She had conducted herself so that her outrages were even more individual than public. Fundegid did more evil. Brumhilde yet made more evil feared. Brumhilde made yet more evils feared. In other words, she not only Fundegid did more. What Brumhilde did made thinking that what Brumhilde did, what Friedegid did, was going to be nothing compared. That's why they feared it. In this crisis, the nation was not satisfied to put order into the feudal government. It also wanted to secure its civil government, for the latter was still more corrupt than the former. So therefore, the latter, in other words, that the feudal government, the latter was still more. In other words, this was the civil government was more corrupt than the former. So they wanted this to be, and this corruption was the more dangerous as it was older, in a way, involved the abuses of Moors more than the abuse of the laws. In other words, he's saying here that again, this is that line that it looked it wanted to secure its civil government because the abuses in the civil government was worse than the abuses in the um, feudal government, and because its corruption was more dangerous, as it was. He said that the corruption was older corruption, and it involved abuse of Moors and than the abuse of laws. In other words, the feudal thing seems to be abuse of laws, while this is the abuse of Moors. The history of Gregory Tours and other records show us, on the one hand, ferocious and barbarous nation, and on the other, kings who were no less so. Kings who were no less so. These princes were murderous, unjust, and cruel because the whole nation was. If Christianity sometimes seems soft to soften them, it was only through the terror that Christianity gives the guilty. In other words, the terror of this, the fear of death, the fear of hell. In other words, it was again. This is interesting. He says here what he says that these kings, their kings was the nation. These princes were murderous, unjust, and cruel because the whole nation was, right. And if Christianity softened them, it's because the terrors that Christianity gives the guilty. The church defended themselves from them. The church defended themselves from them by the miracles and prodigies of their saints. The kings were not sacrilegious because they dreaded the penalties of sacrilege, but in other areas they committed, both in anger and cold blood, all sorts of crimes and injustice because they did not see the hands of divinity so present in these crimes and these injustices. In other words, he didn't see. In other words, some things sacrilege they feared, but these crimes they didn't see the divinity in these things, right? Do not see the hand of the divinity so present in these crimes and injustice. The Franks, I have said, tolerated murderous kings because they were murderous themselves. They were not struck by the injustice and pillaging of their kings because they too plundered and were unjust. There were many laws established, but the kings rendered them useless by certain letters called precepts. Right? Um, let's see, prescriptions. Right? Let's see, 20. Hold on. These were orders that the king sent to judges for them to do or permit certain things contrary to the law. So prescriptions, right? Precepts. There's certain letters called precepts. They sent to judges to command the judge to do something that was contrary to laws, which revised these same laws. These were nearly like the receipts of the Roman emperors, either because the kings took this usage from them or because they drew it from the depths of their own nature, right? One sees in Gregory of Tours that they murdered cruelly and put the accused to death before they had ever been heard. They gave precepts in order to make illicit marriages, right? 21. This is the famous C. Gregory Tour's History of the Franks. The history and charters are full of these, and the extent of these abuses appears in the addictive purifying, right? Illicit marriages that they gave them to transfer inheritance, right? They gave them to remove the right. They gave them to remove the right of relatives. They gave them for marrying nuns. They did not, in truth, make laws on their own initiative, but they suspended the practice of the ones that were made. Right? They suspended the practice of these laws that were made. The edicts of Clotaire redressed all grievances. One could no longer be condemned without being heard. And this again, this is the relatives were always to inherit according to the order of the established by the law. All precepts for marrying girls, widows, nuns were nullified, and those who had obtained and made use of such precepts were punished severely. Precept. We would know perhaps more exactly what was enacted concerning these precepts if Article 13 of this decree and the following two articles had not been lost over time. We only have the first word of Article 13, which orders the precepts to be observed. This cannot mean the one he had just abolished by the same law. We have another constitution from the same prince, related to his edicts and otherwise correcting, point by point, all the abuses of the precept. The precepts, right? 25. Okay. In the Bezimian edition, M's argument has been revised, general acceptance, but the issues are still controversial, right? We have only known the first word of this, uses of this, correcting point by point all the abuse. It is true that M. Bellus, finding this constitution without the date or the place it was given, has attributed it to Clotaire the One. It is from Clotaire the Second. I shall give three reasons for this. One, it states there that the king will preserve the immunities granted to the churches by his father and grandfather, right? 26. The preceding book I've spoken about these. What immunities could the grandfather of Clotaire I, who was not yet a Christian, who lived before the foundation of the monarchy, have granted the churches, right? But if one attributed this degree to Clotaire II, one will find his grandfather to be Clotaire I, who himself had immense gifts to the churches in order to atone for the death of his son Charam, whom he had burned with his wife and children. 2. The abuses that this constitution correct lasted after the death of Clotaire I and reached their peak during the weak reign of Guntram, the cruel one of Chilifric, and the detestable regencies of Fredegund and Brumhilda. Now, how could the nation suffer grievances so solemnly prescribed without ever crying against their continued return? How could they not have done then what they had? What could they not have done then when they did when they pressed Chilfric II, who had taken up the old violent ways again? Right, 27. He began his reign at 260s, right? And back to 26. Let's go look at 26 for a second. Did I miss 26? Yeah, I did. I did. 26 is grandfather, right? In other words, in violent ways, in order that laws and customs should be followed in judgments, as they had in formal times. Right? 28, see the lives of Saint Ligus, right? And back to 26, in the preceding book, I've shown that these immunities were the concessions of judicial rights in which prohibitions against royal judges performing their functions in the territory, and thus were equivalent of setting up concessions or fees. Right? That's why that other note was up there. Sorry, I just wanted. Now, this last paragraph of this chapter, second chapter. Finally, this constitution made a redress to grievance. Finally, this constitution of Chilfric II made or the Clotaire the second thing, right? Clotaire, right? Had to be Clotaire. Finally, this constitution made to redress grievances cannot belong to Clotaire the first because there were no complaints in this regard during his reign, and because his authority was consolidated in his kingdom. Because especially given the date for this constitution, whereas it accords very well with the events that occurred in the reign of Clotaire II, which caused the revolution in the political state of the kingdom. History must be illuminated by laws, and laws by history. So therefore, that's interesting. In other words, this is a very general principle. If you want to study history, you want to study law. In other words, history must be illuminated by the laws, right? And the laws must be illuminated by the history. It's the interconnection between law and history. History and law and history. Okay, this is a very interesting point here in that sense. I think that's right in that sense. Chapter 3, the authorities of the mayor and of the palaces. Let's go back for this point here. That history and laws have to be enumerated, and I think there's a general principle here. That the history is just the events of what happened. Laws are trying to change behaviors and actions, and therefore changed by the reality, the real things. Not by necessarily by theory. Theory is important. Theory shapes the nature of law, but law itself, the laws are trying to explain action, and therefore to understand the action, you have to know the context of what is going on here in history. Does that, right? That's the whole point of this. This is why there's the interconnection of history and law and history in this fundamental sense. And they're very much very much connected, and understand why this revolution happened and why this need for reform happened, of this constitution reform, correcting everything, of this reform of the political state, the civil right, um, it needs to understand the context by which it happened and when it happened, and he's given the explanation of this. Now, chapter 3, the authority of the mayors of the palace, right? The mayors of the palace. I have said that Clotaire II had promised not to remove Warszawwa from the provision of mayor during his lifetime. This revolution had another effect. Until this time, the mayor was the mayor of the king, and he became the mayor of the kingdom. Right, the mayor of the king. Formerly, the king had chosen him. Now, the nation chose him. Okay. So, in other words, the idea was that before the revolution had another effect. Until this time, the mayor was the mayor of the king, and when he became the mayor of the kingdom. Formerly, the king had chosen him. Right. Now, the nation chose him. Before the revolution, Protadus had been made mayor by Theodoric, and Landric by Friedegund. But afterwards, the nation was in possession of their election. Right? See this line of here, and the sources of these things. Right? This one, thus, one must not confuse, as others have, these mayors of the palace with those who had this rank before the death of Brunhilde. Okay, so therefore, in other words, don't confuse that the mayor of the palace with those who held that rank before Brunhilde. The mayors of the kings with the mayors of the kingdom, right? So therefore, the mayors of the king with the mayors. So therefore, the mayors of the palace with those who held that rank before the death, right? One sees that in the laws of the Burgundians, that among them the post of mayor was not one of the highest state. Okay. mayors were not, nor was it one of the most eminent among the first Frankish kings. So the first Frankish kings didn't have this in a high regard. Clotaire reassured those who held posts in fief, and after the death of Warnekar, when this prince asked the lords assembled at Troyes who they wanted to put in his place, they all cried out that they would not elect anyone, and asking for his favor, they put themselves in this hand. So, in other words, this is at the same. In other words, this is from the time here, and he goes. In the same year, Clovis assembled the Burgundian princes and lords at Tyres. He asked if they might wish that now that Clonidel Warszawa was dead, to rise another to the same level as honors. They all unanimously denied they wished to elect a mayor of the palace, vigorously seeking grace from the king to transact the business with him. That they wanted to do this, right? This Dagobert Dagobert united the whole monarchy, has had his father. The nation relied on him and did not give him a mayor. Thus, this prince felt himself at liberty, and being reassured, besides, by his victories, he went back to the plan of Brunhilde. But this led him to such failure that the lords of Austrasia let themselves be defeated by the Slavs and returned home, and the marches of Austria left prey to the barbarians. The victory by the Wells over the Franks was well deserved, but it was obtained not so much by boldness of the Slavs, but by the senseless actions of the Austrasians, who saw themselves hated and being constantly robbed by Dagobert. So Dagobert was robbing them, hated by Dagobert. Therefore, these guys just didn't care. He decided to propose that the Austrasian cede Austrasia to his son Sigebert with a treasury, and put the government of the kingdom and the palace in the hands of Cunibert, Bishop of Cologne, and Duke Adsgraziel Ada Legseal. Okay, they have these horrible, weird Danish, Friediga does not go into detail about the arrangement made at the time, but the king confirmed them all by his charter, and Austrasia was immediately out of danger. Thereby, it became known that the Austrasian were useless in defending the boundaries of the kingdoms of the Franks against the Huns. Dagbert, feeling death was near, commended his wife Netachild and his son Clovis to commended his wife Negatria and his son to Agia. The lords of Neustria and Burgundy chose this young prince for their king. Okay, this is the Chronicles, right? And Agia and Netachild governed the palace. They returned all the goods Dagbert had taken, and the complaints ceased in Neustria and Burgundy as they had ceased in Austrasia. After the death of Agia, Queen Netachild made the Lord of Burgundy promise to elect Froyachad their mayor. Okay, again, this is just that. He sent to the bishops and the principal lords of the kingdom of Burgundy letters in which he promised that he would preserve their honors and their ranks forever. that during their lifetimes, and this is the 41, right? Florechad swore by the sacraments in the letter to all the lords and the Burgundian kingdom, as to also to the priests, to protect and perpetuate their degree and honors and dignity. Right, therefore, he confirmed by words of his word by an oath, and it is from this time and that the author of the Book of Mayors of the Royal House dates the beginning of the administration of the kingdom by mayors of the palace, right? 42. In short, at the time of Clovis, who was son of the king Elas Dagbert, a true father of Theodoric, because Theodoric was a bastard, the Frankish kingdom began to appoint mayors of the household, right? So this idea of this is starting here. This is that line here, right? Kingdom mayors of the palace. Friedrich Burgundian had given great detail about the mayors of Burgundy at the time of the revolution of which we speak, then about the mayors of Austrasia and Neustria. But the agreement made in Burgundy were for the same reasons made in Neustria and Austrasia. The nation believed that it was safer to put power in the hands of the mayor, whom it elected, and on whom it could impose conditions, than in those of a king whose power was hereditary. So the idea of the mayor of the manor, the mayor of the mayor of the manor, the man of the manor, is a kind of a check on king power, right? Chapter 4. What the genius of the nation was in regards to the mayors. So this is the idea of the genius of the nation. The nations elect the mayor. The mayor is a check on the king, or at least a mechanism to mechanize his power. Right? A government in which the nation had a king and elected someone who was to exercise royal power seems very extraordinary. But I believe the Franks, independent of the circumstances in which they found themselves, took their ideas about this from the distant past, right? They elected the things. This is from the idea that they had the mayors of this, and this idea that they did here was not something innovation. He thinks it's from the distant past. They were descended from the Germans, of whom Tacitus says that their choice of king they determined according to nobility, and in their choice of leader according to virtue. Right. This is 43. Tacitus. They chose a king with respect to nobility of birth. Their generals for their strength. These were the Merovingian kings and the mayors of the palace. The first were hereditary, the second were elected. So the mayors of the kings were that, the mayors of the palace were elected, right? One cannot doubt that most of these princes, whom in the assembly of the nation rose and proposed themselves as leaders of some expedition to all those who wanted to follow them, for the most part, united in their person both the authority of the king and the power of the mayor. Right? This original things they their nobility had given them royalty, and their virtue caused them to be followed by a number of volunteers whom chose them as leader. It gave them the power. Gave them the power of the mayor. So the original German kings had both these principles at their stake. He's saying that the original Frankish kings, in that sense, were leaders. They were they were in that status because of their birth and nobility. But then they sought to do some great adventure, which then got people to follow him. They elect him in that sense. Um, their nobility had given them royalty, and as their virtue caused them to be followed by a number of volunteers who chose them as leader. It gave them the power of the mayor. By their royal dignity, our first kings were at the head of the tribunals and the assemblies, and gave laws with the consent of these assemblies. By their dignity as dukes and leaders, they made expeditions and commanded armies. Right. In other words, so therefore, the first kings were like what he says. They had this double side. Then they also had the assemblies. These assemblies will follow them, right? They were head of a tribunals and assemblies, and gave laws with the consent of these assemblies. By their dignity as dukes and leaders, right? In the sense, right? They're dukes and leaders. They made expeditions and commanded these armies, right? In order to know the genius of the first Franks in this respect, one has to look at the conduct of Arbogast of the Frankish nation, to whom Valentina gave the command of the army. Right. This is in 552. See Supergrators. Right. He enclosed the emperor in the palace. He permitted absolutely no one to speak to him of any civil or military business. Arbogast did at that time what the Pippins later did. Chapter 5. How mayors obtained their commands of their armies, right? How the mayors obtained the commands of their armies. When its kings commanded armies, the nation did not think of choosing a leader for itself, right? Clovis and his 4 sons were the head of the French and led them from victory to victory. Theobald, the son of Theobald, a young, weak, and sickly prince, was the first king to remain in the palace. Right. So therefore, it's here that all of a sudden the other kings went out in the war. This is the first one who did it. This is at 552, right? 552, 452. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Sorry. Yeah. 552. Sorry, 552. Okay, that's correct. Sorry, going back and forth. He refused to make an expedition to Italy against Nars, and to his shame, the Franks chose 2 leaders to lead them there. This is 46, and he says, "This is although it was in no way pleasing to their king, they entered into the alliance with Lothar and Gunsilla." Right, these leaders had to go, right? Uh, Of the 4 children of Claudia I, Gutham was the one who most neglected commanding the armies. Gunda did not even join the expedition against Gunvald, who called himself son of Clotaire and claimed this part of the kingdom. Right, so he was, Gundam did not. Other kings followed his example, and in order to put the command in another hand without parallel, gave it to several leaders or dukes. Right? This is sometimes there was 20 in number. See of this. Dagbert, who had no mayor in Burgundy, had the same policy and sent against the Gascon 10 dukes and a number of counts, who had no dukes above them. Right, so therefore all these leaders, like too many heads, like too many disaster. Right. Innumerable drawbacks arose from this. Discipline vanished. Obedience was unknown. The armies were deadly only in their own country. They were burdened with spoils before they arrived among their enemy. One finds in Gregory of Tours a vivid picture of these evils. Right, 49. Yeah, this is. How shall we gain victory? Said Guntram. We who do not preserve what our fathers gained. Our nation is no longer the same. Right. This is quote 50. This is again from Gregory Tours. Curious things. Curious thing. It had been in decline since the time of Clovis's grandsons. Right. In other words, curious thing. It had been in decline since. Therefore, it was natural to settle upon a single duke, a duke who had authority over the infinite multiple of lords and lords, who no longer recognized their engagements, a duke who reestablished military discipline and who had led against the enemy and nation, who by then knew only how to wage war against itself. The power was given to the mayors. Thus, the power was given to the mayor of the. In other words, a powerful duke, and therefore this idea of the mayor of the palace. The mayor of the palace had to. The nation chose him. Therefore, they had this sense. The first function of the mayor of the palace was the government of the economy of the royal household. Concurrently with their other officers, they had the political government of the fiefs. 51. This is like that. In other words, they had the fiefs of the kings. The king's fief. They had political government of the fiefs, and finally, they made disposition of them alone. They also had the administration of the business of war and the command of the army, and these two functions were necessarily linked with the other two. So, war and the command of the army, the administration of the business of war and the command of the armies, depended on what? The maintenance of the king's house royal. In other words, the economy of the royal house and the fiefs, right? The in other words, economy of the thing, and there's also the government of the fiefs, right? These two things, right? In those times, it was more difficult to assemble armies and to command them. And who but the one who dispensed favors could have this authority? So therefore, in other words, command them, getting them together, you had to dispense favors, right? So therefore, the economy of the government of the thieves, right? Who could have this authority? In this independent, warlike nation, one had to invite rather than to constrain. One had to give or offer expectations of thieves vacated by the death of their possessors, to reward constantly, to make preferences feared, to make therefore preference of this person has been feared. Therefore, the one who superintended the palace had to be the general of the army. So therefore, those who controlled run the government of the thing, this gave the and that someone died, and therefore they were going to get this thing now. Who's going to get it? Therefore I feared that he'll get it and I'll get it. Chapter 6. The second period after the decline of the Merovingian kings. After the punishment of Brunhilde, the mayors were the administrator of the kingdom under the kings. And although they were in charge of war, the kings were nevertheless at the head of armies. And the mayor and the nation fought under them. But the victory of Duke Pepin over Theodoric and his mayors completed the degradation of the kings. Right, the degradation of the kings, and the victory of Charles Martel over Chilefric and his mayor Rainefroy confirmed this denigration. Austrasia triumphed twice over Neustria and Burgundy, and the mayoralty of Australia was virtually attached to the family of the Pippin. This mayoral rose above all the other mayorals, and this house above all the other houses. The victor feared that some man in good standing would seize the king's person to provoke tribute. So therefore, this is this idea that the victors fear that, oh my God, that some would seize the kings to provoke tribute. They kept the kings in a royal house as a kind of prison, right? In other words, they feared that this was going to happen. The kings would be captured, and therefore they would, put them as a royal house as prison. Once a year, they were shown to the people. They were made. They made ordinances, so that he answered what had been taught, or rather commanded, just as if it were given by his own power. So the king's kind of a puppet, right? Um, the ordinance says, but these were the mayors. They replied to ambassadors, but they were the mayor's replies. Historians tell us at this time the mayors governed the kings who were subject to them. 57, right? Pippin, leader of the Franks, held the kingdom of the Franks for 27 years, having kings as a subject. Okay, this makes more sense now. Historian tells us that the mayors governed kings who were their subjects to them, right? The dictum of the nations, the delirium of the nation, the family of Pippin, went so far that they elected as mayor one of his grandchildren, who was still a child. 58. So that he answered what he had been taught to say. Okay, that's what I said. Okay. I got the things. Okay, now I made a mistake. I misread. Sorry, I need to go. The 55 here. This is 55. A king as a country. Not that what I said before, but rather here he conceded his seat, the royal and the royal throne under his power. So therefore, this is the words that the kind was a kind of prison, right? They made ordinances. 56. Yeah, therefore, again, that the king was said that, right? 57 over here, the subject to that. 57, I was looking at the wrong line. Pippin, leader of Franks, held the kingdom for 27, the subjects, right? Yes, I said that. And then he was still a child, 58. It's very slow, but I still go look at it. He goes, Grimbold's young son, Theodore, was made mayor of the palace in his place by the command of King Dubbard, right? So therefore, okay, this is the Pippins were such okay. That they were elected even a grandson of his, right? It established him mayor over a certain Dagobert and put one phantom on top of another. So Dagobert was a phantom, and that this grandchild was up there. That's how Pippin was so respected and so loved, right? Chapter 7. On the great offices and fiefs under the mayor of the palace. The mayor of the palace took care not to reestablish the revocability of posts. In other words, and offices. They ruled only by the protection that they granted the nobility in this regard. In other words, again, the purpose of the mayor was that they didn't want arbitrary of king giving and taking things away. So therefore, they didn't not the idea of revocation of a grant. Therefore, they kind of did not reestablishment this, taking things away in that sense of posts and offices. Because this is how they they ruled by the protection they granted the nobility, right? Thus, the great office continued to be given for life, and this usage grew even stronger. But I have some particular reflections to make concerning fiefs. I do not doubt that, beginning at this time, most of them had become hereditary, right? In the Treaty of Enderlot, Gundrab and his nephew Childebert undertook to maintain the liberalities given to the lords and to the church by the kings who preceded them. Queens, daughters, and widows of kings were permitted to bequest by testament, and forever the thing they held from the fiscs, right? They again 60. This is like this regulators by it is by their own free will that if they wish to make something the property of another or wish to confer it to another, be it land, revenues, monies, it will be guarded and preserved in perpetuity, right? Um, so Markov wrote his formula at the time of the mayors. Many of them one sees the king making gifts to a person and to his heirs. And as the formulas were image of an ordinary action of life, they prove that by the end of the reign of the Merovingians, a part of the fiefs have already passed to their heirs. At, at that time, they were far from having an idea of an inalienable domain, right? It's an inalienable domain that can in other words, they were far from having the idea of this inalienable domain. This is a very modern thing, which was then known neither in theory nor in practice. So there's this idea of this domain, an alienable domain, something that they could not be given away. They can be given, but usually, okay, you're not going to take it away. But it's not this idea that it's inalienable. You cannot separate it because, no, I couldn't alienate it. The king, if I want to, I can give it away and do something. It's something inalienable. No, they did not have an idea of this. One will soon see the factual proof of this. And if I refer to a time when there were neither benefits for the army nor funds for its upkeep, one will surely have to agree that the former benefices had been alienated, right? They had been alienated, right? In other words, former things given to these things were alienated. They were lost. They were given away. This is the time of Charles Martel, who founded new fiefs, a time that must be distinguished from the first one. When the kings began to make gifts forever, either because of the corruption which slipped into the government, or because the constitution itself, which obliged kings to reward constantly, it was natural that they should have begun to give fiefs in perpetuity, right, rather than countries, perpetuity, to give fiefs in perpetuity rather than counties. Okay, to do without a few pieces of land was a little moment. To give up great offices was to lose power itself. So I'd give fiefs away rather than counties, right? The counties were the sort of counts and the power, right? I'm not going to give that up, but I can give a little fief away there, a little there, a little there. So therefore, I'm not. I would, give a little moment. Not, but this is what led to the problem of by time of Charles Martel's. There was all these things given away. The money, there's no money to pay for the armies, right? Chapter 8: How the Eloids were changed into fiefs. Now this is D here. Eloids were the freeholds, right? This was how freeholds. The Lloyds were technically freeholds. How they were changed. The way of changing an Eloid into a fief is found in the formula of Mercroft. 63. Again, this is one gave one's lands to the king. He returned it to the giver as a sort of usufruct or benefice, and recommended his heirs to the king. So therefore, you gave the king land. It returned it to the giver as a usufruct or benefice, that you have it to your life and your heir's life, and like this. In order to discover the reason for a man thus to change the nature of his alloy, I must seek as in the first. I must seek, as in the very depths of the old prerogative of the nobility, for which 11 centuries had been covered with dust, blood, and sweat. In other words, I had to go back and this is centuries. This is all done. Everything's been. I have to go 11 centuries in the past to see what's going on. Why has this happened? Okay. But those who held fiefs had great advantages. The settlement for injuries done them was much greater than for freedmen. It seems, according to the formula of Marca, that a privilege the king of a king's vassal was that whomever might kill him would pay 600 sols in settlement. This privilege was established by the Salic law and that of the Rupertians. And whereas the two laws ordered a payment of 600 sols for the death of a king's vassal, they gave only 200 for the death of a freeborn person. a Frank, a barbarian, or a man living under the Salic law, or or only 100 for that of a Roman. Right? Uh, um, this was not the only privilege of the king's vassal. One must know that when a man cited for judgment did not present himself, or did not obey the orders of the judge, he was called before the king, and if he persisted in con- uh, uh, um, his calumny, right, stubborn refusal to obey orders, right, he was put beyond the protection of the king and could not be received in one's home or even given bread now. Given bread. So right, this is the last 68. Now, if he were an ordinary citizen, his goods would be confiscated. But if he were the vassal of the king, they were not. Okay. In first, by his refusal, con, contumacy, was refusal to obey, right, was considered to be convicted of a crime, and the second, and not the second, right? By the first, in this sense, that he was not it was a crime and is punished, and the second, this, not the second. The former was subject to proof by boiling of water for the slightest of crimes. In other words, right? This is again the lex of Gallic law. The latter was condemned to only in the case of murder. So wait a minute, you're boiling people for like other crimes, violent crimes, right? The first, was considered crime. Second was not. The former was subject to proof by boiling water for the slightest crimes. Only the second one was a vassal of the king, who was not. Finally, a vassal of the king could not be constrained to swear an oath against another vassal. Ooh. Okay. Um, these privileges kept increasing. In the capitories of Kalaman, the vassal of the kings are paid the honor of not being obliged to take oaths themselves, but rather being able to have their vassal speak for them. Okay, that's even. So therefore, it makes sense to be, okay, freeborn, you're fucked. Okay, freeborns are fucked now. They're boiled by water. I'm gonna give my land, my freehold to the king, and he's gonna give it back to me, and I become his vassal. And what the vassal is, I'm protected, man. So this is like okay, this is the explanation of why this happens, right? Why Edward becomes a vassal, why the alloys will become turned into vassals, right? In addition, when the one of those one had these honors did not enter the army, his penalty was to abstain from meat and wine for as long as he had been absent from service. But the freedman who had not followed the count owed a settlement of 60 sous and was put into servitude until he'd paid it. So therefore, I'm a vassal of the king. I don't go fight. If I don't go fight, well, I just have to not avoid eating. What was it? Um, I didn't go fight, and then do how long the fighting was. I just had to abstain from meat and wine. But if that didn't, I had to pay 60 sous and were put in servitude until I paid it. Okay, the freeborn. Okay, therefore, it is not easy to think that the Franks, and even more so the Romans, who were not vassals of the king, sought to become vassals. So that they would not be deprived of their domains, their households, and their things. One derived the usage of giving one's alloy to the king, accepting it from him as a fief, and recommending one heirs to him. This usage lasted, but it currently, chiefly at the time of the disorders under Charlemagne, when everyone needed a protector and wanted to join with other lords and enter, so to speak, into the feudal monarchy because they no longer had a political monarchy. So, in other words, this is the idea that he left it to the heirs who were not weak. Right? This is this idea. Right? This continued of the Capians, as is seen in many charters, either by one's giving one's alloyed and taking it back at the same time, or by declaring it an alloyed and recognizing it as a fief. These fiefs were called fief de prize. Okay, fief de prize, fiefs that were taken back. This does not mean that those who had fiefs governed them as good fathers, as a good father does his family. And though freedmen sought fief vigorously, they handled these kinds of goods in a way usufructs are administered today. This is why Charlemagne, the most vigilant and attentive prince we have had, made many regulations to keep them from degrading fiefs in order for their own, in favor of their own properties. Right. In other words, he goes that this again. This is like they would. Fiefs had to be. The fiefs were then degraded to protect wealth their own properties. Right. So that no, you have to make sure that the fiefs are maintained. You can't degrade them. Degrading fiefs in favor of their own properties. This proved only that in his time most benefices were still for life, and that consequently one took more care of alloys than of benefices. But this did not keep up from the preferring vassalage to the king to being a freedman. One could have reasons for despoiling of a certain person. One could have reasons for despoiling a certain person's portion of a fief, but one did not want to lose the rank itself. So he could despoil part of a thief, but didn't want to lose the rank itself. Right. I know too that Charlemagne complained in a capulary. This is 80, right? This is this capulary. This is like a ruling or thought thing. That that in certain places there were people who gave their fiefs they gave as property and later brought them back as property. Gave their fiefs as property and later bought them back as property. But I do not say that they preferred property to usufruct. I only say that when they could make a freehold a fief, they would pass that would pass into their heirs. That would pass it, which is the case of the formula I've mentioned, where there were great advantages in doing so. In other words, that they could pass a fief to the heirs, they would take great advantage of doing so. Right? That was if they could make sure their heirs would inherit this. That's a great advantage doing so. Chapter 9. How ecclesiastical goods were converted into fiefs. So how ecclesiastical things were not made into fiefs. Okay, this is the good of the fist, the good of the fist of treasury, in essence, should have no other destination than to serve as gifts for the kings could make to encourage the Franks to new expeditions to do things, which increased the goods of the fiscs as well. Right. So therefore, this is, and it was, I have said, the spirit of the nation. Right. But gifts took another direction. So therefore, the fiscs did this, but gifts went another direction. Right. Fiscs, the money spent here, have no other things to encourage actions and great deeds, which then produce more revenue that then produce the good of the nation, to incur, the spirit of that nation. Right, I've said the spirit of the nation, but the gifts took another direction. We have to speak of Chilifric, the son of Clovis, who even then complained that almost all his goods had been given to churches. Our fiscs have become poor, he said. Our wealth has been transferred to the churches. Now only the bishops reign. They are great, and we are no longer great. Why? This is why mayors, who did not dare to attack lords, despoiled the churches. This was the reason that Pippin alleged for entering Neustria. Neustria was that he had been invited there by the ecclesiastics to check the expeditions of their kings, that is, of the mayors, who were depriving the church of its goods. Right. So, in many ways, the mayors were kind of acting against this. So the mayors of Austrasia, that is, the house of Pippin, had treated the church with more moderation than had been done in Neustria and Burgundy. And this was very clear in our chronicles, where the monks never tired of admiring the devotion and liberality of the Pippins. They themselves had occupied the highest positions in the church. A crow does not pluck out the eye of another crow, says Childebrand, said to the bishop. Crow does not pluck the eye of the other crow. Pippin thought Neustria and Burgundy brought Neustria and Burgundy into subjection. But as he had used the pretext for the opposition, he used the pretext of the opposition of the churches to destroy the mayors and the kings. He could no longer despoil them without contradicting his own title and showing that he was mocking the nation. But the conquest of two great kingdoms and the destruction of the opposing parties furnished him with sufficient means to satisfy his king. In other words, he didn't have to do this, right? Pippin made himself master of a monarchy by protecting the clergy. So Pippin did this by making himself the master, protecting the master by, in other words, he conquered these nations, and he could satisfy his troops by taking the wealth that they had. Didn't have to take this spoil the church. Charles Martel, his son, could maintain himself only by oppressing them, the clergy. As this prince saw that part of the royal goods and part of the goods of the fisc had been given for life, or as property to the nobility, and that the clergy who received the received from the hands of the rich and the poor alike, had acquired a greater part of the earloids, he despoiled the churches. And as fiefs of the first division no longer existed, he formed fiefs of a second. In other words, as the fiefs of the first division no longer existed, he formed fiefs a second time. We've done this now, 86. Removing jurisdictional property from the ecclesiastics, he appropriated this real estate to the fiscs and then distributed it to a soldier. In other words, this is how he did it, right? He took for himself and his captains the good of the churches, and even churches, and put an end to the abuse which, unlike ordinary evils, was the easier to cure for being so extreme. So the church did this, they did put the money there, they decided doing this. So therefore, this is chapter 10, the wealth of the clergy. The clergy received so much during the reign of the Merovingians, Carolinians, and the Capians that they must have been given the whole of the goods of the kingdom several times. But if the kings, the nobility, and the people found the means of giving them all their goods, they nevertheless found the means of taking them back. Under the Merovingians, piety founded churches. Under the Merovingians, piety founded churches, but the military spirits gave them to military men who divided them among their children. Right. So founded their church, but then gave them the military men who divided among children. How many lands left? How many lands left the revenue of the clergy? Right. That's not right. The Carolinian kings opened their hands and were again immensely liberal. The Normans arrived, pillaged and ravaged, persecuted the priests and monks above all, sought out the abbeys and even religious places, looked for whatever religious place they could find, for they attribute to the ecclesiastics both the destructions of their idols and for the violence of Charlemagne, who had obliged the Normans repeatedly to take refuge in the north. These were hatreds that 40 or 50 years could not make them forget. In this state of things, what a quality of goods the clergy lost. There were scarcely any ecclesiastics to ask for their return. It remained, therefore, for the piety of the Captians to make enough foundations and grants of lands. The opinion that had been punished and believed in those times would be deprived the laity for all their goods. In other words, the opinions that had been published and believed in those times would have deprived the laity of all their goods if they had not been sufficiently honest people. But if the ecclesiastics were ambitious, so were the laity. If a dying person gave something, his heirs wanted to take it back. One sees only quarrels between lords and bishops, between gentlemen and abbots, and vigorous pressure must have been put on ecclesiastics because they were obliged to put themselves under the protection of certain lords who defended them for a time and oppressed them ever after. So therefore, in other words, okay, this is a better police, which had become under a better police, which was becoming established under the Carpathians, already permitted the ecclesiastics to increase their goods. So they were increasing their goods, right? The Capuchins allowed the Calvinists appear and had everything of gold and silver in the churches made into money. How could the clergy have secured their fortune, right? Their very existence was not secure. They treated controversial matters and burned and and one burned their archives. And one burned their archives. What use was it to ask from an impoverished nobility? What use was it to ask from an ever impoverished nobility the return of that which it no longer had, or which it had mortgaged 1,000 ways? The clergy have always acquired, they have always returned, and they will still acquire. So therefore, the clergy keeps on. The nobility they've gotten, but then they've lost, and they don't have anything. They have nothing. The clergy they've always acquired, they have returned, and then they have reacquired stuff. Chapter 11: The State of Europe at the Times of Charles Martel. Charles Martel, who undertook to despoil the clergy, was in the most fortunate circumstances. He was feared and loved by the warriors, and he worked for them. He had the pretext of his war against the Saracens, the Muslims, right? However hated he might have been by the clergy, he had no need of them. The Pope, to whom he was necessary, opened his arms to him. One knows the celebrated embassy sent to him by Gregory the Third, right? The Pope, right? This is 88, right? Gregory sent a letter to him above all, including a resolution from the Prince of the Romans, a resolution from the Prince of the Romans that the Roman people did indeed wish to return to his protection and an equal clemency, and to leave the domain of the emperor. Right? He proposed the pact that he would withdraw from from the imperial side. These two powers were closely united because they could not do without each other. The Pope needed the Franks to support him against the Lombards and the Greeks. So the Pope had a problem. The Pope needed Pippin, Charles Martel, because he needed Charles to get rid of this problem of the Pope had the problems of the Lombards of the north and the Greeks, right? Charles needed the Pope in order to humble the Greeks, to embarrass the Lombards, to make himself more respectable at homes, and to accredit his titles and those of his children might take, right? This is 89. One can see in the authors of these times, the impression is that the authority of so many popes made on the spirit of the French. Though King Pepin had already been crowned by the Bishop of Vannes, He regarded the unction he received from the Pope Stephen a thing which confirmed him all his rights, right? This idea of the king crowning and bishop of this, right? Even though it was therefore he could not fail in his enterprise, right? Saint Unchiler, Bishop of Orleans, had a vision that astonished the princes. On this topic, I must relate the letter that the bishop assembled at Rheims write to Louis the German, who had entered the lands of Charles the Bald, because the letter very aptly shows us what was at the time the state of things in the situation of the men's spirits. The bishop says, when Saint Insir was snatched up to heaven, he saw Charles Martel tormented in the bottom of hell by the orders of the saints who are to by the orders of the saints who are to be with Christ at the last judgment, that he had been condemned to this penalty before that time for having despoiled the churches of their goods and for having in this way become guilty of all the sins of those who had given them. That King Pepin held a council on this subject, that he caused to be returned to the churches all the ecclesiastic goods that he could obtain, and as he could only recover only part of them because of his quarrels with Veli, Duke of Aquitaine, he had letters called Precarium, precreations, he had letters precreations written in favor of the churches for the remainder, right? These, and he ruled that the laity would pay a tithe on the goods it held from the churches, and 12 deniers for each house, right? In other words, this is what King Pippin wrote, right? That they did this, and then they're going to do this. That Charlemagne did. He ruled that the laity would pay a tithe on the goods it held from the churches, and 12 deniers for each house, right? That Charlemagne did not give away the goods of the church, that he made, on the contrary, a capitory in which he promised for himself and his successors never to give them away. That all they that sorry that all they propose is in writing, and that several had even heard it told that Louis Pius, father of two kings. Right. This is this thing that was sent. Right? The regular. Okay. This is that. Yeah. This is what a bishop says. This is 91. This is 91. This is of this. 92. That remainder. This is that line. Um, Precario tenure, whose use had been concealed by prayer. I find the charter of King Pippin dated at the 30th year of his reign that this prince was not the first to establish these letters called Precarium. He was the one. He cites one made by the mayor of Etrobin and continued since this was a charter of the king in that sense, right? The regulation of King Pippin, which the bishop speaks, was made at the Council of Lippines. The church found the church found this advantage in it, that those who had received some of its goods now held them, but precariously, and that besides it received the teeth and 12 deniers for each dwelling that had belonged to it. But this was a palliative remedy, and the ill still remained. Even this was contradictory, and Pippin was obliged to make another capitulary, in which he enjoined those who held the benefices to pay this tithe and fee, and even keep up the houses of the bishops or monasteries on penalties of losing the goods even given them. Right? Charlemagne renewed Pippin's regulations. That the bishops that the bishops say in the same letter that Charlemagne promised for himself and his successors to no longer divide the goods of the churches among the warriors is consistent with the capitularies of this prince, given at Auch-le-Capelle in 803, made to claim the terrors of to calm the terrors of ecclesiastics on this matter. But the gifts already made continue to exist, right? The bishops add, with reason, that Louis the Pious followed the conduct of Charlemagne and did not give the goods of the church to the soldiers. Nevertheless, the former abuses went so far that under the children of Louis the Pious, the laity established priests in its churches and drove them out without the consent of the bishops. Okay, the churches were divided among their heirs. And when they were not kept up in a seeming way, the bishop had no other recourse than to remove the relics. Right. This is the idea. This is that he removed the relics, things that were there. The capitularies given at Campagne establishes that the king's deputies might inspect any monastery with the bishop, on notice to and in the presence of the one who held it. And this general regulation proves that the abuse is general, right? It was not that the laws were lacking for the restitution of church goods. When the Pope reproached the bishops for the neglect of and reestablishment of monasteries, they wrote to Charles the Bald that this reproach did not concern them because they were not guilty of it, and they informed him of what had been promised, resolved, and enacted in so many assemblies of that nation. Right? And indeed, they cite 9 of them. They continued to quarrels. The Normans arrived. In other words, they continued to quarrel. The Franks, the princes of this and that. And then they continued to quarrel. Right? And the Normans arrived and made them all agree. The Normans. Oh, okay. So the Normans make them all agree. That's a great line. Uh, Chapter 12, the establishment of times. The regulation made under Pippin had given the churches the expectation of relief rather than actual relief, and that of Charles Martel had founded the whole public patrimony in the hands of the ecclesiastics. Charles found the goods of the ecclesiastics in the hands of the warriors. One could not make the latter restore what they had been given, and the circumstances that at the time rendered the things even more impractical than it was by its nature. On the other hand, in other words, on the one hand, Christianity was not to perish for lack of ministers, temples. So on the one hand, in other words, it was just too impractical. But Christianity was not going to perish for lack of ministers, temples, and instructions. Right, 103. In the civil wars that sprang up at the time of Charles Martel, the goods of the churches of Rome were given to the laity. The clergy was left to subsist as it could, as it was said of the life of Saint Réaume. Um, um, MGH considered it spurious and quotes to the passage to which this refers to. Right, these things. This is why Charlemagne established tithes, a new kind of good, whose advantage to the clergy was that later usurpations would be more easily recognizable, as they were given in other words, that later usurpations would be easier recognizable as they were given exclusively to the church. Right, tithes were just given to the church, but the other things were tithes. Some had wanted to give much earlier dates to this establishment, but authority they cite seem to me to testify against those who allege them. The Constitution of Clotaire says only that certain tithes could not be levied against the goods of the church. Far from the church levying tithes in those times, it only intended that it was to be exempted from them, right? The Second Council of Macron, held in 585, which orders tithes to be paid, says that in truth they had been paid in former times. But it also says that they were no longer paid at that time. Who can doubt that before Charlemagne, one had opened the Bible and preached the gifts and offerings of Leviticus? But I say that prior to this prince, tithes may have been preached, but they weren't established. Tithes were established legally under this sense. They were preached and they weren't as established as a principle in this way. I have said that the regulation made under Pippin had subjected those who proposed ecclesiastical goods as fee to paying tithes and making reparations to churches. It was a great deal to oblige the principal men of the nation to set an example by law whose justice could not be disputed. In other words, it was a great deal to oblige these principal men of the nation to set an example by a law whose justice could not be disputed. Charlemagne did more, and one sees by his Capitois de Villes that he obliged his own lands to pay tithes. This was a great example. But the common people was scarcely able to abandon their interests for this example. The Synod of Frankfurt gave them a more pressing motive to pay tithes. A capitory there said that if in the last famine, grave empty husks of grain were found, that that they had been devoured by devils whose voices had been heard reproaching them for had been heard reproaching for not have paid the tithes, and consequently all those who held ecclesiastical goods were ordered to pay tithes, and as a further consequence, everyone was ordered to do so. Charlemagne's project did not succeed at first. This burden seemed overwhelming. Among the Jews, the payment of tithes was a part of the founding plan of their republic. But here, the payment of tithes was a burden independent of those established by the monarchy. One can see in the provision added. One can see in the provision added to the laws of the Lombard. The difficulty there was in having the tithes accepted in civil law. One can judge by the different canons of the councils how difficult it was to have them accept an ecclesiastical law. So that it was, So the question among the Jews, payment times was part of this, and that one can see in the provision of the laws of Lombard the difficulties of having these done in civil laws. Now, one can judge by the different canons of the council how difficult this is. The people finally consented to pay tithes on the condition that they could redeem them. The constitution of Louis Pius and that of Emperor Lothair, his son, did not permit this. The laws of Charlemagne on the establishment of tithes were the work of necessity. Religion alone had a part of it, and superstition none. Right? In other words, it was a thing of necessity. Religion alone had to do this. Right? The famous division that he made of tithes into four parts: for the building of churches, for the poor, for the bishops and the clerics, proves that he wanted to give the church the fixed and permanent estates that it lost. Right? Give them the money that they lost. That's what remedy that thing. His testament shows he wanted to. His testimony showed that he wanted to remedy completely the evils of his grandfather Charles Martel has done. He divided his movable goods into three equal parts. He wanted two of them to be divided into 21 parts. For the 21 archbishoprics, sees, the sees of his empire. In other words, empire, the seats of his empire. He wanted them to be 20. He wanted movable goods divided into 3 equal parts. He wanted 2 of them to be divided into 21 parts for each one of the archbishops that could be of his empire. And for each part was divided. In other words, each part was to be subdivided between the archbishop's see and the bishops dependent on it. So therefore, this archbishop, this 21 parts of 3 of his parts, right? He divided the remaining third into 4 parts. He gave 1 part to his children and his grandchildren. Another was addressed added to the thirds already given to that. And the 2 remaining were used for pious works. It seemed that he regarded, in other words, it seemed that he regarded the immense gifts he had given to the churches less as a religious act as a political dispensation. It was not as you can see by how he does his testimony of this. Right, Charlemagne's divided his goods, his testament, right? How he divided it, and then he continues it. He says he's going to do that. Okay, his last 4 things. What he says, 1 to his children, 1 to the divided remaining, a big third, into 4 parts. 1 he gave to his children's grandchildren, right? Another was added to the thirds of given. The last 2 were doing pious works, right? Not giving to the church, but doing these things, right? So this was a political dispensation. Chapter 13, the election of bishops and abbot. As the church had become poor, kings gave up electing to the bishoprics and to other ecclesiastical benefices. Princes were less involved in naming someone to them. The authority was less frequently claimed by the candidates. Thus, the church received the kind of compensation for the goods, a kind of compensation for the goods that had been taken away from it. There was, they quit interfering, quit micromanaging and interfering of who was selected as bishops, right? So bishops and other ecclesiastical benefits, kings gave up electing these things, okay? And if Louis the Pious left to the Roman people, if Louis the Pious had left the Roman people the right of electing popes, it was the result of the general spirit of his times. One acted towards the Archbishop see in Rome as towards the others. In other words, the Archbishop of Rome said, that elected the popes of this. I'm not going to do it. They're not important. These archbishop things have no money. They have no real influence. So I leave them alone. Chapter 14 on the feasts of Charles Martel. Now I'm going to warning sounds. Okay. The feast of Charles Martel. I shall not say whether when Charles Martel gave the goods of the church in fief, he gave them for life or in perpetuity, right? They life or forever. All that I know is that in the time of Charlemagne and Lothair I, there were these sorts of goods which passed to heirs and were divided among them, right? He doesn't know whether he gave them these goods that he took from the church as either for life or this. But they were these goods that were formerly of the church that were given like this, right? It says were passed to their heirs and were divided among them. I find in addition that a part was given as an eloid and the rest as leaf, right? This is fief. See the constitution cited above, the Capetra of Charles the Bald, right? This is one of these things. I have said that owners of eloids were subject to service like those who possessed fiefs, right? They had to pay, they had to go to service, they had to go to this, right? That was no doubt partly why Charles Martel gave goods as alloys as fiefs. So alloys was freehold lands and fiefs, right? This is why he gave them both, right? Alloys still had to provide, the freeholders had to still service in the counties and things like this. But they had obligations, but they didn't. They got, that's why he gave both and not just one. Chapter 15, continuation of the same subject. It must be observed that the fiefs had been changed, in other words, as fiefs had been changed into goods of the church, and the goods of the church into fiefs, fiefs and the goods of the church each took something from the nature of each other. Thus, the goods of the church had the privilege of fiefs, and the fiefs had the privilege of good of the church, such as were honorary rights that were seen to appear in those times in churches, right? Okay, this is 122. Let's see that he says here, okay, he goes from the capitories, he says, in which there are honorific rights of the lords established as they are today, right? And as these rights have always been attached to high justice, in preference to what we today, call the fief, it follows that the patrimonial justice was established at the same time in these rights. So therefore, that these, in other words, that the church, the property of the church became fiefs, and like this, and therefore that what happened was, therefore these fiefs and the goods of the church and fiefs both had to exercise justice in this regard. Chapter 16. Confusion between royalty and morality, mayoralty, the Carolinians. The order of the subject had made me disturb the order of time. So in other words, the subject of themes that this had disturbed time. I have spoken of Charlemagne before speaking of that famous time of the transfer of the crown to the Carolinians, which was made under Pippin. A thing, unlike ordinary events, is perhaps more noticed today than it was even at the time it happened. So, in other words, he says that, the transfer of the crown to the Carolinians, which was made under King Pippin, right? Things in other words, an ordinary event was something. Kings had no authority; they had a name. The title of king was hereditary. The title of the mayor was elective. Although mayors in later times had put on the throne the Merovingians whom they wanted, they had not taken a king from another family, and old laws which gave the crowns to a certain family had not yet erased from the hearts of the Franks. So therefore, the king was tied to a certain family. The mayors would put maybe one of this family, that family, but the mayors did not go to another family, right? There's this idea that one family had the right of the king. This is the Franks, right? The person of the king was almost unknown in the monarchy, but royalty was not. Pippin, son of Charles Martel, believed that it was appropriate to blend these two titles. In other words, he wanted to blend both the mayor of the thing and these things together, right? Blur these two titles. It was appropriate to blend these two titles, a confusion that would always leave some uncertainty as to whether the new royalty was hereditary or not. And this sufficed for the one who joined with great power with that royalty. In other words, at that moment, mayoral authority was joined with royal authority. In the mixture of these two authorities, a kind of reconciliation occurred. The mayors had been elected, the king's hereditary. The crown at the beginning of the reign of beginning at the reign of the Carolinians was elected because the people did the choosing, and it was hereditary because they always chose the same family. Father Lecointe, in spite of the testimony of all the record, denies that the Pope authorized this great change. Okay, 24, I guess it says 24 and 25. The story was invented after Pippin's death and was much opposed to the equality and equity and sanctity of Pope Zachariah. Right. This is what Father Lecointe says. That denies the Pope this. He reasons by saying the Pope would have done a injustice. And it is a marvel to see a historian judge what men have done by what what they should have done, right? This way of reasoning, there would be no more history, right? In other words, we should doing what they have done by what they should have done. No, no. This is no longer history. No need for history. This is mocking again. Montesquieu mocking this, right? Um, um, be that as it may, it is certain that from the moment victory of Duke Pippin, his family reigned, and the Merovingians reigns no longer. When his grandson Pepin was crowned king, it was it was only one more ceremony and one less phantom. In other words, there was two things. The phantoms. He was not two phantoms, now one phantom. Right. He acquired nothing. He required nothing by it except royal attire. Nothing changed in the nation. I have said this. I have said this in order to fix the moment of the revolution, so that one does not make the mistake of regarding as a revolution that which was only a consequence. So therefore, he says, I fix this moment. It's the Pippin's son that has both of these, and it's like that. The grandson Pippin. He says that I'm going to. He says that one does not make the mistake of regarding as a revolution that which was only a consequence of the revolution. When Hugh Capet, the first Capian, was crowned king, there was a greater change because the state passed from anarchy to some kind of government. But when Pippin took the crown, it was a passage from a passage of one government to the same government. When Pippin was crowned king, he changed the name only. But when Hugh Capet was crowned king, things changed because a great fief, united with a crown, brought an end to the anarchy. When Pippin was crowned king, the title of king was united to the greatest office. When Hugh Capet was crowned, the title of king was united to the greatest fief. The fief, like this. It was tied to this giant fief of France, right? Chapter 17. A particular matter in the election of the Carolingian kings. One sees in the formula of the consecration of Pepin that Charles and Carolyn were also anointed and blessed, and that the French lords were obliged, on penalty of interdiction and excommunication, never to elect anyone other than a Carolingian. Right? This is they have to do this. They have to. The French lords, in other words, that Charles and Carolyn were also anointed. Right? This consecration of Pepin, that Charles and these other two people were anointed and blessed, and that all the obligation, everyone was saying these three things. It seems, according to the testimonies of Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, that the Franks chose between the children of kings, which is closely related to the clause mentioned earlier. And when the empire passed to another house than that of Charlemagne, the faculty of election, which had been restricted and conditional, became pure and simple, and one departed from the former constitution. Pippin, feeling his end near, convoked the ecclesiastical and lay lords at St. Denis, and divided his kingdom between his two sons, Charles and Carloman. We do not have the acts of that assembly, but one finds what happened there in the author of the old historical collections edited by Canicus, and that of the Annals of Metz, as Monsieur Bellus has observed. I see there too I see there too somewhat contradictory things. That he made the division with the consent of the important men, and then he made it by the paternal right. So he made it with that, and he says, "Oh, made by paternal." This proves what I've said, that the right of the people during the reign of this house was to elect within the family. It was properly speaking a right to exclude rather than a right to elect. In that sense, they can say no, this one, not that one, right? In other words, that therefore he divided his. This was hereditary. He did this, but He did this um, paternal right. He gave things by paternal right, but then it was at the same time it was election, or both at the same time. This kind of election, this kind of right of election is confirmed by the records of the Carolinians. Such is the capitular and the division of the empire that Charlemagne made during his three children, in which, after the division was formed, he says that if one of the three brothers has a son, the people wants to elect him to succeed to his father's kingdoms, his uncles will consent to it. In other words, the people propose this guy, this one, they would consent to it. This same provision is found in a division that Louis the Pious made among his three children, Pippin, Louis, and Charles, at the assembly of Aix-la-Chapelle, and in another division by the same emperor made 20 years earlier between Lothair, Pippin, and Louis. Right. One can also see see the oath that Louis the Stammerer made in Compiègne when he was crowned. I, Louis, constituted king by the mercy of God and the election of the people, do promise. Right. This is that. If you ever do this, you ever get, if you're doing this book, the edition is great. The notes are fantastic. So I just go use the notes. Maybe I shouldn't be doing the notes because it's taking longer. But I just thought it would be good for people to see it. I do this. What I say is confirmed by the acts of the Council of Velis held in 890 for the election of Louis, son of Bosso, to the kingdom of Arles. Arles. Louis was Louis was elected to it, and the principal reason given for this election was that he was of the imperial family, and that Charles the Fat had given him the rank of king, and the Emperor Arnulf had invested him by the spectre and by the attendance of his ambassadors. The king of Arles, like the others previously a part or dependent of Charlemagne's empire, was elective and hereditary. 18, Charlemagne. And this is going to be a big one if I remember correctly. Oh, it's going to be short. This is one paragraph. Charlemagne thought that he would keep the power and nobility within its limits, and curtail the oppression of the clergy and the freedmen. So he tempered the orders of the state that they were counterbalanced, and that he remained the master. Everything united by the force of his genius. He constantly led the nobility from expedition to expedition. He did not leave them time to form designs. He occupied them entirely in following his design. His empire maintained by the greatest. The empire was maintained by the greatest of leaders. The prince was great. The man was greater. The children were his first subjects, the instruments of his power, and models of obedience. He made admirable regulations. He did more. He had them executed. His genius spread all over the parts of the empire. One sees in its laws of this prince a spirit of foresight that includes everything in a certain. In other words, one sees in this prince a certain spirit of foresight that includes everything in a certain force that carries everything along. Pretexts for avoiding duties are removed, negligence corrected, abuses reformed and foreseen. Right? He knew how to punish. He knew still better how to pardon. So he knew how to punish it. He foresaw that. This is a great prayer. In vast, pardon, vast in his plan, simple in executing them. He, more than anyone else, had a high degree the art of doing the greatest things with ease, and the different difficult ones promptly. So therefore, he had this. What he sees is high praise. He's saying that he had a high degree, the art of doing the greatest things with ease, the difficult things promptly. He traveled constantly over his vast empire, offering his hand wherever it happened to be. Matters of business arose everywhere. And he brought to them a conclusion everywhere. Never did a prince better know how to brave dangers. Never did a prince better know how to avoid them. He mocked all perils, and particularly those which great conquerors almost undergo. I mean conspiracies. Again, this is great. Machiavelli conspiracies. How to do it? He right here, and he goes, "Oh, yeah, I mean, he had it. He mocked perils and perils that would undergo." And he means, I mean, conspiracies. This prodigious prince was extremely moderate. His character is gentle. His manner is simple. He loved to live among the people of his court. He was he was perhaps too susceptible to pleasure with women, but a prince who always governed by himself and who spent his life working can deserve more excuses. In other words, a prince who always governed by himself and who spent his whole life can deserve deserve more excuses. He regulated his expenditures admirably. He developed his domains wisely, attended wisely, attentively, and economically. The father of a family, he could the father of a family could learn from his laws how to govern his household. Right. In other words, this is an interesting 138. This is like praising of Charlemagne to a great degree. One sees in his capitories the pure and sacred source from which he drew his wealth. I shall say only one word more. He ordered that the eggs from the farmyard of his domain and the unused vegetables of his garden be sold. And he distributed among his people all the wealth of the Lombards and the immense treasuries of those Huns who had despoiled the universe. In other words, again, 139. See this entire capillary. It is a masterpiece of prudence, good administration, and economy. So high praise. My God, go read Charlemagne's thing about how his managing of his household. Go read. This is a masterpiece of good prudence, good judgment, and household economy. That's interesting. Okay. Uh, so again, this ends with that wonderful praise of this. Maybe someone should print out his things. It would be maybe a good idea for someone to take his ideas, what these things are, and publish them out again. This chapter about economy. Idea for a book. Okay, we're taking forever on this thing, so this is making me a little depressed. This is going to be a long video. 19, continuation, same subject. Charlemagne and his early successors feared that those whom they placed in distant spots would be inclined to revolt. They believed that they would find more docility among the ecclesiastics. They set up in Germany a great number of bishops and joined them with great fiefs. Right. This is this 140 in that sense. That in other words, that therefore, because they thought churchmen were more loyal and more docile, not going to revolt. It seemed among some of the charters that the clauses containing the prerogatives of those fiefs were no different from those of ordinary put in such grants. Though today one sees the principal ecclesiastics of Germany invested with sovereign power. That it may be these were the principal pieces they moved forward against the Saxons. When Charlemagne and his successors could not expect from the indolence and negligence of the Lord, they believed they could expect from the zeal and an active attention of the bishop. Besides, such a vassal, far from using subject peoples against them, would, on the contrary, need them for support against his people. Right. Therefore, this is the idea that the bishops would always be like, okay, I need help from the king, the emperor, to help against the people. Right? So Chapter 20, Louis the Pious, right? When Augustus was in Egypt, he had the tomb of Alexander open. He was asked if he wanted to open those of the Ptolemies. He said that he wanted to see the king and not the dead. Thus, in the history of Charlemagne, in the history of the Carolinians, one seeks in Pippin and Charlemagne, one wants to see kings and not the dead, right? Therefore, he wants to see the tomb of Alexander open. He asked if the Ptolemies are there. He's dead. I want to see the real man who did this, right? That one seeks not the dead. Wants to see the kings and not the dead. A prince, the puppet of his passions, and the dupe of even his virtues. A prince who knew neither his strength nor his weaknesses, who did not know how to gain for himself either fear or love, who had few vices in his heart, but all sorts of failings in his spirit, took in his hands the reins of an empire that Charlemagne had held. So this is like, this is, okay. In other words, Pippin's and Charles, right? In other words, a prince took this Charlemagne's things, right? In other words, who had few vices in hearts, but all sorts of failings in his spirit, took his hands the reins, the empire that Charlemagne held. At the time when the universe is in tears for the death of the father, in that instant of shock when everyone asks for Charles and finds him no more, in the time when he hastens to fill his place, he sent ahead some he trusted to arrest those he had contributed to the disorderly conduct of his sisters. Right. This is about Lewis. Right. This is the idea of Lewis. Right. In other words, he got someone like this, but this is two things he says. An instant when everyone was asked. So again, this is this idea of Lewis. Right. In other words, what does he say? He sent someone he trusted to arrest those who had contributed to the disorderly conduct of his sisters. He caused bloody tragedies, right? 142. In the collection of the Duches, right? These great tragedies. These were hasty acts of imprudence. He began to avenge domestic crimes arriving before arriving at the palace, and stirred spirit of rebellion before becoming master. So therefore, he put out the eyes of Bernard, king of Italy, his nephew, who had come to plead for his clemency, and who had died a few days later. That multiplied his enemies. His fear of them made him decide to have his brothers stripped of their goods. This further increased the number of his enemies. He was much reproached by the last 2 points. One did not fail to say that he had broken his oaths and solemn promises that he made to his father on the day of his coronation. Right. This is 144. Again, he ordered him to show unlimited clemency, unfailing mercy for his sisters, his brothers, his nephews. Right. Broke his oath. After the death of the Empress Irmgard, by whom he had 3 children, he married Judith. He had a son by her, and soon blending the compliance of an old husband and with the weakness of an old king, he put a disorder into his family that brought the fall of the monarchy. Right? He constantly changed the division he made for his children. However, these divisions had been confirmed in turns by his oaths, by those of his children and those of his lords. He wanted to attempt the faithfulness of the subjects, to seek to put confusion, scruple, and ambiguities into their obedience, to compound the various rights of princes, especially at a time at a time when, as fortresses were few, the few ramparts of authority was the feudal promise. What was feudal promised and feudal received, faithfulness, fealty promised. In other words, this was in other words, they weren't fortresses. The fealty that my promise of my promise and this thing, fealty promised and fealty received. This was the real fortress in that sense, right? In order to maintain their shares, the emperor's children solicited the clergy and gave them rights and heard unto them. These rights were specious. The clergy were brought in as a guarantee that of things which one wanted had wanted authorized. So therefore, this is like these rights were spurious, and the clergy would give a guarantee these spurious things. Albergod explained to Louis the Pious that he had sent Lothar to Rome to be declared emperor, that Lothar had made divisions among his children after having consulted heaven in 3 days of fasting and prayers. What could a superstitious prince do, especially when attacked by superstition itself? Pardon. Surprise. Okay, pardon. Yeah, so, excuse me. I didn't hit the stop button quick enough. I've been trying to do this. Hit by superstition itself. One sees that one senses that sovereign authority has twice thwarted by the imprisonment of this prince, and by his public penitence. One had wanted to degrade the king. One degraded royalty. At first, one could scarcely understand how a prince who had a number of good qualities, who did not lack enlightenment, who naturally loved the good, and to put it briefly, was the son of Charlemagne, could have enemies so numerous, so violent, and so reconcilable, so eager to offend him, so insolent in his humiliation, so determined to ruin him. And they would have ruined him irredeemably the second time if his children, fundamentally more honest people than they, if the children, fundamentally more honest people than they, had been able to follow out a project and agree on something. In other words, chapter 21, continuation of the subject. The strength that Charlemagne had put into the nation lasted well enough under Louis the Pious for the state to maintain its greatness and to be respected by foreigners. The prince's spirit was weak, but he was a warrior. But his was a warrior nation. Authority within was being ruined, while power abroad did not appear to diminish. So the internal was corrupt, falling apart, but the power of it is. Charles Martel, Pippin, and Charlemagne governed the monarchy in succession. The first flattered the avarice of the soldiers, the other two that of the clergy. Louis made them both discontented. In the French Constitution, the king, the nobility, and the clergy all held the power of the state in their hands. The king, nobility, and the clergy. Charles Martel, Pippin, and Charlemagne sometimes joined their interests with one of the two parties in order to contain the other, and almost always with both of them. But Louis the Pious detached both of these bodies from himself. He antagonized the bishops by regulations that they saw as rigid because he went further than they themselves wanted to go. There are very good laws made in an appropriate way. There were very good laws made in an appropriate way. The bishops accustomed in these times to go to war against the Sacrilans and Saxons were far from having a monastic spirit. On the other hand, he had lost confidence in his nobility. He elevated people from nothing. Okay. He says that this was done rarely under Charlemagne, was done was certainly done under Louis. Right? Okay, I want to go over here the monastic spirit, right? 47, because it's funny. Um, when the bishops and clerics began stop wearing their belts and uh, golden cross belts, on which were hung knives with sets of precious stones, their clothing and inclusive taste, and whose spurs were ornaments weighed down on their heels. But the enemy of humankind would not suffer such devotion, and made the ecclesiastics of all orders rise up to bring on the war. Right? This idea. Okay. We're like people, right? We're like nations. So therefore, he made these people from nothing, right? People from nothing. He deprived the nobility of their possessions, dismissed them from the palace, called in outsiders. He separated himself from these two bodies. He was abandoned by both of those things, right? Chapter 22, continuation, same subject. But what weakened the monarchy above all was that this prince dissipated its domains. In other words, okay, make sure it dissipated. We did. I know what it means, but it's an adjective to overindulge essential pleasures, to dissolve, made immoderate. To verb, it is to disappear or cause to disappear, waste away and fritter. So therefore, the prince wasted away its domains. Now in 50, as he says, he handed over to his fides as a perpetual possession the royal estates, which had been his own, his grandfather's, and most remote ancestors. He did this for a long time. In other words, he gave it to other people to benefit. At this point, one should listen to Nithard, one of the most jealous, judicious historians, grandson of Charlemagne, who was attached to the party of Louis the Pious, who uh, uh, wrote his history on the orders from Charles the Bald. He says that a certain Alahard had had uh, uh, had for some time such an empire over the emperor's spirit that this prince followed his will in all things. That at the instigation of this favorite, he had given the goods of all the fiscs, give had given the goods of all the fiscs to all who had wanted them, and in that way he had reduced the republic to nothing. The public thing, the republic to nothing. He persuaded them to distribute liberties here, public revenues there, among his own. He all but destroyed the state. Nicaragua says, right? He all but destroyed his state. He did this throughout the empire, and I have noted that he and I have noted that he did in and I have noted what he did in Aquitaine, something Charlemagne readdressed, and no one redressed again. In other words, again, this is 153. It's in Book 38, Chapter 13, right? He did, go back to the last book in Chapter 13. Um, the state had been drained when Charles Martel came to be mayor. The one was in such a circumstances that it was no longer a question of an act of authority to establish a state. The fix were so poor that under Charles the Bard, honors were maintained for no one, and no one ever accorded security except for silver. The Normans were permitted to escape for silver when they could have been destroyed, right? And Hemachar, first consul to Louis the Stammerer, was to ask for an assembly for the wherewithal to support the expense of his household, right? In other words, this is 155. This is like all these things that should have been done, that they were just done like this. Continuation, same chapter 23. Continuation, same subject. The clergy had cause to repent of the protection they had granted the children of Louis the Pious. This prince, as I have said, had never given the goods of the church by had never given the goods of the church by precept to laity. But soon Lothar in Italy and Pippin in Aquitaine abandoned the plan of Charlemagne and went back to that of Charles Martel. In other words, taking things with the, in other words, Pippin, Lothar, and the ecclesiastics had recourse to the emperor against his children, but they themselves had weakened the authority they had appealed to. In Aquitaine, there was such a compliance. In Aquitaine, there was such compliance. In Italy, there was no obedience. So the princes just, in other words, these emperors and these guys, the people of that, the civil laws that had disturbed the life of Louis the Pious were the seeds of those that followed his death. The three brothers, Lothair, Louis, and Charles, each sought to attract the important men to his party and make them his creatures. They gave to those who wanted to follow them good precepts for the good of the church. In order to win over the nobility, they delivered the clergy to them. So, in other words, they gave to those who wanted to follow them the precepts for the good of the church, right? In other words, they brought important men to this party to make them his creatures. They gave them the precepts. They wanted them to follow the precepts for the good of the church. And in order to win them over, they delivered the clergy to those people. One sees in the capitories that these princes were obliged to cede to importune demands, and that what they did not want to give was often taken from them. One sees in them that the clergy believed itself more oppressed by the nobility than by the kings. It also appears that Charles the Bald attacks the patrimony. In other words, Charles the Bald attacked the patrimony of the clergy the most, either because he was the most provoked by them, because they degraded his father on his account, or because he was the most timid. Be that as it may, one sees in the capitories the continued quarrels between the clergies who demanded the goods and the nobility refused, avoided, and deferred returning them, with the king between the two of them. Right? This is that. The state of things in those times is a spectacle worth a pity. Whereas Louis the Pious had made immense gifts to the churches from his domains, his children distributed the goods of the clergy to the laity. Often the same, often the same hand that founded new diocese despoiled the old ones. The clergy did not have a fixed estate. Its goods were taken away from it. It regained them, but the crowns always lost. Towards the end of the reign of Charles the Bald, and after his reign, it was scarcely any longer a question of quarrels between the clergy and laity over the restitution of the goods. The bishops were indeed still grumbling when they wrote their remonstrance to Charles the Bald, who are found in the Capillary of 1856, and the letter they wrote to Louis the German in 1858. But they proposed things and they claimed promises that had been evaded so many times that one sees they had no expectations of attaining them. The only question that remained was to address in general the wrongs done in the state, church and the state. 61, right? This is again this. If you want to go look, I'm not going to go read them because this is for 10. You often restatement of these things, right? The kings promised not to take away from the lords their freedmen, and no longer give to ecclesiastic goods, no longer to give ecclesiastic goods by precept, so that the interest of the clergy and the nobility appears to unite them. Right. The foreign ravages by the Normans, I have said, contributed to much to bringing these quarrels to the end. In other words, the Normans came and they said, "Okay, we have to stop fighting each other." The king daily more discredited, both for the causes that I have given here and for those I shall give. Believe they had no choice but to put themselves in the hands of the ecclesiastics. But the clergy had weakened the kings, and the kings had weakened the clergy. In vain did Charles the Bald and his successors appeal to the clergy to sustain the state and to prevent its fall. In vain did they use the respect the people had for this body to maintain the respect people should have for them. Right? In vain they did seek. They, in vain they in vain they seek to give authority to their laws by the authorities of the canon. In vain they joined ecclesiastic penalties to civil penalties. In vain, to counterbalance the authority of the counts, they gave each bishop the rank of deputy to the province. It was impossible for the clergy to redress the evils they had done, and that strange misfortune of which I shall soon speak made the fall of the crown. This thing I should talk about. He's saying that the church, the king used the clergy used the king, and they corrupted each other in a sense, made it each thing worse and worse. I mean, this is very Machiavellian critique of the church. You get a very hostile critique of the corruption of the church in the sense. In that sense, and the emperor himself, and the vanity of an emperor, who is, particularly Charles, and what he's done. He tried to use the church and the authority of the church to support himself, and by doing all these things he gives here, and every one of them ends up leading to the destruction of this. Right? He says that it is impossible for the clergy to address these evils that they have done, and that strange misfortune of which I shall speak in the next chapter, for the crown. Chapter 24. The freedmen became qualified to possess a fief. I have said that freedmen went to war under their counts, that the vassal went under their lords, right? So therefore, the freedmen under the count, the vassals under their lords. This made the order of the state balance each other, and through the lords that had vassals under them, they could be restrained by the counts, who was at the head of all the freedmen in the monarchy. At first, these freedmen could not petition for a fee, but subsequently they could, and I find that this change occurred between the reign of Guntrab and that of Charlemagne. I prove it by the comparison that one can make of the Treaty of Anderlecht, agreed to by Gundam, Trumbut, and the Queen Brunhilda, with the division made by Charlemagne for his children, and similar division made by Louis the Pious. These three acts contains very similar provisions in regard to vassals, and the same points were regulated in very nearly the same circumstance. The spirit and the letter of the three treaties are nearly the same in this regard. But but what concerns freedmen, there is a major difference. The Treaty of Anderlecht does not say that they could possess that they could petition a fee. In other words, Anderlecht does not say they can petition a fee. Whereas one finds in the division of Charlemagne and of Louis clauses explicitly made so that they could petition. This shows that after the Treaty of Anderlecht, a new usage was introduced by which freedmen became qualified of this great prerogative. That was the dividing a fief, division of the fief, alienate their fief in that sense, right? This must have happened when Charles Martel distributed the goods of the church to his soldiers, partly in fief and partly as alloyed, bringing about a kind of revolution in the feudal laws. It is likely that nobles who already had fiefs found it more advantageous to receive the new lands as new gifts as alloys. In other words, that had fiefs was more advantageous to receive these gifts as alloys than the freedmen, and that the freedmen were only happy to receive them as fiefs. In other words, So therefore, the nobles had already had thieves, got alloys, the advantageous that were there as their property, personal property, and that the freedmen were happy to receive fiefs. That, in other words, they got both the goodies, right? Chapter 25, the principal causes for the weakening of the Carolinians, the change in the freeholds. And therefore, this is this whole idea. He's saying that the change in the freeholds, this is what destroyed the Carolinians. Charlemagne, the division of which I had spoken of in the preceding chapter, ruled that after his death, men of each king would receive benefices in the kingdom of their kings, but not in the kingdom of another king. Whereas one could preserve one's alloy in any kingdom whatever. So therefore, they can only do it there, but the alloys can be preserved. But he added that any freedman could, after the death of his lord, command himself for a fief in the three kingdoms to whomever he wanted, just like the one who had never had a lord. One finds in the same provision in the division made by Louis the Pious to his children. Although freedmen petitioned for a fief, the soldiery of the count was not weakened by it. So in other words, although freedmen participated, the soldiery of the count was not weakened by it. A freedman still had to contribute for his alloy, and get people ready to do the service belonging to the fief in the ratio of one man for 4 manors, or else he got a man ready to serve the fief for him. And as some abuses were introduced thereby, they were corrected, as apparently the Constitution of Charlemagne and that of Pippin, of the King of Italy, which explain each other. What the historians have said, that the Battle of Fontenay caused the ruin of the monarchy, it is quite true. But let me be permitted to look briefly at the land and both consequences of this day. Sometimes after this battle, the three brothers, Lothair, Louis, and Charles, made a treaty in which I find clauses that must have changed the whole of French political state. In other words, these clauses really changed the fundamental of the whole French political state in that sense. In the proclamation, Charles made to the people about the part of this treaty which concerns them, he says that every freehold could choose the lord he wanted, whether the king or another lord. Before this treaty, the freehold could petition for a fief, but his alloy would always remain in the immediate power of the king, that is under the jurisdiction of the count, and he depended on his lord, to whom he had petitioned only by reason of the fief that he obtained from him. After this treaty, every freedman could subject his alloy to the king or another lord as he chose. It is not a question of those who petitioned for a fief, but of those who changed their alloy into a fief, and left, so to speak, the civil jurisdiction in order to enter the power of the king or the lord they wanted to choose. Therefore, in other words, this is a political change, you're saying. That by doing this, by this treaty, and by what is done, this has now left the people to choose their king in that sense, and no longer obligates them to their. In other words, they had double. They could do that for their fief. They had to go like this, but their alloy they had to do to the count, and had to stay within that structure of this, right? And they could choose something, but they could only choose, every freedman could subject his alloy to the king or another lord as he chose. It is not a question of those who petition for a fief, but of those who change their alloys into a fief, and left, so to speak, the civil jurisdiction in order to enter the power of the king or the lords they wanted to choose, right? Thus, those who were formerly directed under the power of the king, insofar they were freedmen under the count, became imperceptibly vassals of one another. For each freedman could choose the lord he wanted, whether the king or another lord. Two, so that's one thing, right? That's one problem. Two, if a man changed a land he possessed in perpetuity into a fief, these new fiefs could no longer be for life. Thus we see, thus we short, we, thus we see shortly after a general law giving the fief to the children of the possessor. This is from Charles the Bald, one of the three princes whom had contracted to this. What I have said of the liberty of all men in the monarchy after the treaty of the three brothers is to choose the lord they wanted from among the kings and the other lords is confirmed by the acts passed after that time. In Charlemagne's time, when a vassal had received the thing from the lord, even if he was worthy only of a vassal, he could not leave him. But under Charles the Bald, vassals could follow their interest or their caprice with impunity. And this prince expresses himself so strongly on this point that he seems rather to invite them to enjoy this liberty than to restrict it. In Charlemagne's times, benefices were personal rather than real. Latter, they became real rather than personal. So therefore, this is in other words, this is this. The revolution happens because of change of the freehold, right? The first is the change of this is the weakening of the Carolyn. First, the freeholds changes the freeholds. Now, the changes to the fiefs. Chapter 26. Um, Fiefs underwent no less a change than did the alloys. One sees by the capitories of Campania made under the King Pippin, then to those the kings gave the benefits themselves, gave a part of the benefits to the various vassals. But these parts were not distinct from the whole. The kings took them back when he took the whole. And on the death of the lord, the vassal also lost the underfief. A new beneficiary came, who in turn established a new undervassal. Thus, the new underthief was not at all a dependency of the fief. It was the person who was dependent. In this way, the undervassal reverted to the king because he was not attached to the vassal forever. And the underfief reverted likewise to the king because it was the fief instead and not a dependent of the fief. In other words, it was a fief. So therefore these things like this, they were reverted to the king in that sense. Under such vassalage, such was the under vassalage when the fief were revocable. Such was it also when the fiefs were for life. This changed when the fief passed to the heirs, and the under fiefs were passed in the same way. So it was changing. Before originally everything revoked back up to the king. In other words, this was this when this person died. Well, in other words, when the fief died, this reverted back this, and they decided to do it this way. When this died, these people under him were then subjected back to the king, that authority, right? And that's how it was when it was like this. This is how it was like this. But after this, they needed. But when they became perpetually owned by this, you needed what? You needed to no longer do this. You had to change this. Same way. And with the king, what the king has held in mediation was no longer held except by mediation, and the royal power, so to speak, pushed back a degree, sometimes two, sometimes more, right? So therefore, the king was just the mediating of these transitions in that sense. One sees in the Book of Fiefs, that along with the vassals of the king could give land as a fief. In other words, vassal could give a land as a fief. That is, as an under fief of the king. Underneath these under vassals or petty vassalaurs could not likewise give land as a fief. So what they had given, they could always take back. Besides, such a consensus did not pass to the children as did fiefs did, because it was supposedly not made according to the laws of fiefs, right? These under vassals. If one compares the state of the usage of the state of under vassalage at the time when the two senators of Milan wrote these books, with the state at the time of King Pepin, one finds that these under fiefs kept their primitive nature longer than the fiefs. In other words, that the under fiefs still maintained the characters of fiefs more than the fiefs themselves. But when these senators wrote, one had made such general expectations to this rule as to reduce it almost to nothing. For if one who had received a fief from a petty vassor had followed him to Rome on expedition and acquired all the rights of a vassal, in the same way, if one had given silver to a petty vassor in order to obtain a fief, the latter could not take it away. The latter could not take it away from another, or keep one from handing it down to one's son until he had returned the silver to him. Right? That they had returned the silver to him. Oh, was that he couldn't stop him. I give the silver, and I had the right to do everything else. Finally, this rule was no longer followed in the Senate of Milan. Right? This is another changes in the fief. In Charlemagne's time, this is chapter 27, other changes in the fief. In Charlemagne's time, one was obliged under the threat of general penalties to go to the convocation for any war or whatever. Excuses were not accepted, and the counts who exempted someone would himself be punished. But the Treaty of the Three Brothers put restrictions on that took the nobility out of the king's hands, so to speak. One was no longer expected to follow the king to war, except when that war was defense. Therefore, before this, offensive wars, the king had to do this. Now, only had to do it because of defense war. One was free in other wars to follow one's lord or to look after one's business. This treaty is related to one another. This treaty is related to one made 5 years earlier between the brothers Charles the Bald, King Louis, and King Louis, King of Germany, by which these two brothers excused their vassals from following them to the war in the cause of some expedition against other, a thing to which the two princes swore, and which they made both armies swear. A death of 100,000 Frenchmen at the Battle of Fournet made the remaining nobility think that, in other words, a death of 100,000 Frenchmen at the Battle of Fontenay made the remaining nobility think that they would finally be exterminated by the quarrels of these kings over their shares, and the ambition and jealousy of these kings would spill all the blood left to be spilled. A law was made providing that the nobility would not be constrained to follow their princes to war, except it was a condition of defending the state against the foreign inventions. It was in use for many centuries. See the laws of Gino, king of Rome, among those who were added to the Salic law and the legates of business. Right. Chapter 28. Changes that occurred in the great offices and of the fief. It seems, in other words, this is another thing. So the first thing was the revolution was this. The next one was about the freeholds, then the fiefs, and now change that occurred in the great offices and the fiefs, right? The great offices, right? It has seemed that everything took on a particular vice and was corrupted at the same time. I have said that the early times left fiefs were inalienable in perpetuity, but these were particular cases. The fiefs in general still preserved their proper nature. But if the crown had lost fiefs, it substituted others for them. I have also said that the crown had never alienated the greatest office in perpetuity, right? But Charles the Bald made a general regulation in effect that the great offices and the great fiefs equally. In other words, he made a regulation that this affected both the great offices and the great fiefs, right? He established that his caputaries in the counties which would be given to children of the count. He wanted this regulation also applied to the fiefs, right? So he not only the certain children at certain count, some offices would get, that these children would get these offices, but therefore the fiefs would apply as well. It will soon be seen that this regulation was more broadly extended, so that the great offices and the fiefs passed to more distant relatives. It followed that most of the lords who formerly answered immediately to the crown answered to it to to it only immediately. Those counts who had formerly rendered justice in the king's audience, these counts who led freedmen to wars, stood between the king and his freedmen, and the power was pushed back another degree. In other words, these guys now at no longer tied to the king. They were like going to be perpetual, and therefore the power of this now was even further out. There was more, it seems, according to the caputaries, that the counts had benefices attached to their counties and the vassals under them. When the counties became hereditary, these vassals of the counts were no longer immediate vassals of the king. The beneficiaries attached to the counties were no longer the benefices of the king. The counts became more powerful because the vassals they already had put them in a position to procure others. They were able to get other people to go do this. So therefore, this gave, it took away power with this. By making these the counties, hereditary counties, it created a situation that removed the king from power, king of these, and these people became, because all the wealth was theirs now, and they could use that to gain more support, more loyalty. And the king has weakened in that sense, right? In order to get a good sense of the weakness that resulted at the reign of the Carolinians, one has only to see what happened at the beginning of the reign of the Capians, when the multiplication of under thieves was the despair of the great vassals. It was the custom of the kingdom that when the elder sons had given shares to the younger ones, the latter paid homage for them to the former. So the dominant lord was no longer held. The dominant lord no longer held them exempt as under thieves in that sense, right? Held them as except as under thieves. Philip Auguste, Duke of Burgundy, the Counts of Nevers, Bouillon, Saint Pierre of Dampierre, and other lords declared that from then on, when the fief was divided by inheritance or otherwise, the whole would always be the dependency of the same lord, without any lord between them in that sense, right? So therefore they would be that there's no lord between them in that sense. This ordinance was not generally followed, for I have said elsewhere, it was impossible to make great general audience in those times. But many of our customs were set by it. So therefore there was no way to make a general law. This was not universally followed, but this became the rule eventually, saying. Chapter 29, on the nature of the fiefs during the reign of Charles the Bald. I have said that Charles the Bald wanted, I think this is Charles the Bald wanted an office or fief to pass from the man who had held it to a surviving son. It would be difficult to follow the progress of the abuses resulting from this, and from the extension of this to the laws of each country. In other words, he says, this abuse, Charles the Bald wanted this to happen, everything to be successes. This is like this. I find the book on fiefs that in the beginning of the reign of Emperor Conrad II, the fiefs in the country that he dominated did not pass to the grandsons. They passed only to the child of the last possessor of the Lord chosen. Thus, the fief were given by a kind of election that the Lord had made among his children. I have explained in chapter 17 of this book how the Carolinians, the crown was in a certain respect hereditary, right? The family was this and like this. So therefore, this is like echoing that. It was hereditary because the kings were always taken from this family. It was hereditary also because the children inherited. It was elective because the people chose among the children. As things followed one another, and one political law is always related to another political law, the same spirit followed in the inheritance of the fief, and that had followed in the succession to the crown. So therefore, a house, in other words, yeah, as at least in Italy and Germany, right? This is this idea that this is a connection. How the crown, in other words, how the crown was the way this was done. This was how this was done. I think this is why maybe explain also that that's interesting. The idea of the person. Okay, this is interesting. Um, Thus, the fief passed to the children, both the rights of inheritance and the right of election. And each fief was, like the crown, elective and hereditary. So therefore, the fief was also both elective and hereditary. They were elective and they stay in the same family, but that you were going to get it, who's going to get it, was determined by the higher person, right? This right of election was held by the person. This right of election held by the person of the law did not exist at the time of the authors of the Book of Fiefs. That is, during the reign of the Emperor Frederick I. Chapter 30. On continuing the same subject. It has been said in the Book of the Fief that when Emperor Conrad left for Rome, the faithful who were in his service asked him to make a law so that the fiefs that passed to the children would also pass to their grandchildren, and that one whose brother had died without legitimate heirs could inherit the fief that belonged to their common father. This was granted. So it goes to say, and must be remembered that those who speak lived in the times of Frederick I, that the old jurist had always held that the inheritance of fiefs in a collateral line did not possess beyond full brothers, although in modern times one would have carried it far as the seventh degree, for by new right one carried it in direct line to affinity. Right. It is thus that the law of Conrad was gradually extended. So Conrad's, in other words, this Conrad left for the Rome that they guaranteed this. This rule was extended. That Conrad's thing was extended. When all when all when all these things are assumed, a simple reading of the history of France will show that the perpetuity of fiefs was established earlier in France than in Germany. When Emperor Conrad II began his reign in 1024, things were still in Germany as they had been in France at the time of Charles the Bald, who died in 877. But in France, after the reign of Charles the Bald, so many changes were made that Charles the Simple was not in a position to dispute with a foreign house his incontestable right to empire. And finally, in the time of Hugh Capet, the reigning house, stripped of all its domain, could not even support the crown. Right? This could not even support the crown in this sense. In France, the weak spirit of Charles the Bald put an equal weakness in the state. But his brother Louis the German and some of those who succeeded him had greater qualities. Their state sustained its strength for a longer time. So therefore, in other words, the Charlemagne's things. This is something the Charlemagne's kingdom in France under Louis collapsed, and then Charles the Bald. Louis, and then it collapsed. Right? The empire collapsed. Louis the German kept it, while Charles the Bald things decline. So by the time Hugh Capet comes to France, comes up to takes the crown in France, there's nothing there. There's no resources there of the king left. Here, there is stuff left. The emperor, what am I saying? Perhaps the Flemish humor, and if I dare say it, the immutability of the spirit of the German nation rested longer than the French resisted longer than the French nation this assignment in which fiefs, by their natural tendency, were perpetuated in families. I add that the kingdom of Germany was not devastated, so to speak, wiped out as that of France by the particular kind of war that the Normans and the Saracens waged over it. There was less wealth in Germany. There were fewer towns to sack, fewer coasts to travel along, more marshes to cross, more forest to penetrate. The princes who did not the princes who did not see the state readily to fall at every instant had less need of their vassals. Right? This is that is, they depended less on them, and it was likely that the emperors of Germany had not been obliged to go to Rome to be crowned and made continue expeditions in Italy. Their fiefs would have, in other words, if they did not, in other words, it is likely that the German emperors had not been obliged to go to Rome to be crowned and made continual expeditions to Italy. Their fiefs would have preserved their primitive nature even longer. So in other words, he's saying that if they didn't have to go to Rome to get crowned, maybe their fiefs would have lasted longer. Um, Chapter 31, How the Empire Left the House of Charlemagne. The empire, which, to the prejudice of the branch of Charles the Bald, had already given to the bastards of the branch of Louis the German, passed again into a foreign house. With the election of Conrad, Duke of Francois, in 912, the branch that reigned in France and that could scarcely dispute over villages was still less positioned to dispute over an empire. Here we have an agreement passed between Charles the Simple and Emperor Henry, Henry I, who succeeded Conrad. It's called the Pact of Bonn. The two princes met on a ship in the middle of the Rhine and swore eternal friendship. A very good mezzotempo was used. Okay, let's see. No, okay, let's see what French means. Hold on, French. Hold on. I'm a little. Okay, an end, a middle end was used. Charles took the title King of Western France, and Henry that of the King of Eastern France, Frankreich. Charles made the contract with the King of Germany, and not with the Emperor. So they made that. They didn't make it with the Emperor. They made Charles with that. And I did this. I made this. That the King of Western France, King of that. And they made the contract with the King. Chapter 32, How the Crown of France passed to the House of Hugh Capet. The inheritance of fiefs and the general establishment of the underfiefs extinguished political government and formed feudal government. Instead, that innumerable multitude of vassals kings had, they now had only a few on whom the others depended. So there's all network of vassals, right? And only few dependent. The king had almost no direct authority. A power that had passed through so many powers and through such great powers was checked or lost before reaching its goals. Such vassals no longer obeyed, and even used the under vassals in order not to obey any longer. Right. So not only the vassals not obey, they also used the under vassals not to obey. The kings, deprived of their domains and they're reduced to the towns of Reims and Leon, were at their mercy. The tree spread its branches too far, the top dried out. The kingdom was without a domain, as the empire is today. In other words, talking about there was the king had a very situation, but had no power. The emperor himself had no power. Right? This is like the empire. He's talking about the whole Roman Empire today, at his time, right? Um, uh, um, one gave the crown to one of the most powerful. One gave the crown to one of the most powerful vassals. Right, you know, the Normans ravaged the kingdom. They came on a kind of raft and in small crowd, entered the mouth of the rivers, went upstream, and devastated the country along the banks. The town of Orleans and Paris checked these bandits. They could advance neither on the Seine nor the Loire. Hugh Capet, who possessed two towns, held in his hands the two keys to the unhappy vestiges of the kingdom. A crown was conferred upon him that he alone held in possession to defend. In the same way, later, the empire was given to the house that held the boundaries firm against the Turks, right? The Austrians. Right? This is the emperor was there, held against the Turk. So therefore, in other words, this is saying that the same thing in France happened. That the kingdom in France was held against the Normans. Whoever stopped the Normans, this was and therefore the empire, the German empire in Germany, was that the one who stopped the Turk, right? The empire had left the house of Charlemagne at a time when it was established, and the inheritance of fiefs was the result of an act of condescension. Um, that is, inheritance of the fiefs, which was a result of a subordination of commending oneself to the king, and of the king's condescension. Right. This is see note one above. Right. See no I above. I think that's the L above, or maybe L. Oh no, I above. Right. Se recommendo, to put oneself under the protection of, or the say as we commend ourselves to the Lord. Right. Condensation. This was the usage lasting even longer among the Germans than among the French. This usage in the sense condescension. They lasted longer in the Germans. It made the empire considered as a fief elective, right? In other words, this is why the emperor was elective in that sense. Where the French crown left the house of Charlemagne, fiefs who were hereditary in this kingdom, the crown, like a grand fief, was also hereditary. So this is why the French crown was hereditary rather than elective. The German emperor crown was still elective. Moreover, it has been made. However, it has been a mistake to ascribe to the exact moment of this revolution all the changes that had happened, or which happened later. Everything was reduced to two events. The reigning family changed, and the crown was united with the great fief. This is the real thing that happened. They reduced it to the reigning family changed, and the crown was this. Everything was reduced to this. This is the real revolution. Chapter 33. The consequences of the perpetuality of fiefs. It followed that from the perpetuality of fiefs, the right of the eldest, and this is the longest chapter of the book, so we're like getting there, like, oh my God. In other words, it followed from the perpetuality of fiefs that the right of the eldest, or the primogeniture, was established among the French. It was not known among the Merovingians. The crown was divided between these brothers, and the alloys were similarly divided. But fiefs, revocable or for life, not being an object of inheritance, could not be an object of this division. So therefore, fiefs were always unified in the sense of the Merovingians, right? Therefore, they weren't divided. Properties were divided equally, right? This is why on the Carolinians, the title of emperor held by Louis the Pious, which he had honored his eldest son Lothar, made him devise for this prince a kind of precedence over the younger brothers. The two kings were to go to the emperor each year, carry presents to him, receive larger ones from him, and thus were confirmed with him on common business. This is what gave Lothar those ambitions that brought him little success. When Aribod wrote to the princes, he cited the provision of the emperor himself, who had associated Lothar with the empire after God had been consulted by 3 days of fasting and the celebration of masses by prayer and alms, after the nation had given him its oaths, which it could not violate, and after he had sent Lothar to Rome to be confirmed by the Pope. He gives weight to all this and not to the right of the eldest. He says that the emperor had designated the division to the younger children, and that he preferred the eldest. That is to say, he had preferred the eldest to stay at the same time that he could have preferred the younger ones. But when fiefs became hereditary, the right of the eldest was established in the inheritance of fiefs, and for the same reason in that of the crown, the great fief. The old law that formed divisions no longer existed. As fiefs were burdened with service, the possessor had to be in possession to perform it. The right of primogeniture was established, and the reasoning of the feudal laws forced that of the political and civil laws. So therefore, this is, in other words, he's saying that the inheritance and successor hereditary happened because of paternal law. In other words, the the family reality of paternity. This became the civil laws. In other words, the reasoning of feudal law tied to the patronage, the patrimony, and things like this. How this, because this was inherited through this procedure, son inherited from father. Therefore, political law, the political rule was done son inherited from father. Political or civil law. Fiefs passed to the possessor's children. The lord lost the liberty to dispose of them, and in order to be compensated from them, they established a right that was called the right of redemption. M. The shot. This is the right of redemption, of which our custom speaks, which was paid first in the direct line, and which, through usage, came to be paid only in the collateral line. In other words, through the sense of through other sources, not to the main source, right? Yeah, through something in pledged and security for repayment. In other words, in other words, something that was something or something intended for subordination, secondary, descended from the same stock but different line. In other words, side by something situated side by side. Soon fiefs could be transferred to outsiders as patrimonial goods. Right? Fiefs could be transferred out to outsiders as patrimonial goods. That gave rise to the right of permission and sales, established in almost the whole kingdom. So they could sell it. These rights were arbitrary at first, but when the practice of granting these permissions became general, they were fixed in each region. When it became general, they became fixed in each region. The right of redemption had to be paid with each change of heir, and was at first even paid in the direct line. An ordinance of Philip of August, right? The most general custom had fixed it. In other words, the most general custom had fixed it at a year's revenue. So therefore, there's this idea that whoever had to pay it, they had to pay a year's revenue. It was onerous and inconvenient for the vassal, and the fief became, so to speak, in debt. So therefore, the so that fief, so to speak, became in debt. It often happened in the act of homage that the lord would demand for the redemption only a certain sum of silver, which by the changes which occurred in monies became of no importance. Thus, the redemption is today reduced almost to nothing, whereas that of the permissions and sales has continued to exist in its full extent. I'm going to sell something, I have to pay some quantity. But the inheritance, I just know this, as the latter right concerns neither the vassals nor his heirs, but is a fortuitous case of which had been neither foreseen or expected. One did not make these sort of stipulations, and one continued to pay a certain sort of price. When fiefs were for life, one could not give a part of one fief so as to have it always as an underfief. It would have been absurd for the simple holder of a usufruct to have disposed of the ownership of a thing. But when fiefs became perpetual, this was permitted, and certain restrictions set by customs, and was called parting of one fief, or parting of one Gino di son fief. Um, oh, sorry. Let's look at this again. 117. Yeah, that they became specified a portion that one could use, but fiefs cannot be a bridge that is a portion is of its abolished, right? And that these could not have been made use of. These specific that one could make use of. They specify the portions that which could be used. Right? 117. Okay, 117. Sorry. Um, and this is called the parting of this thing, right? This is some things that were permitted, and then certain restrictions by customs, what could be used. And this is called partings of a fief. Once the perpetuity of fiefs caused the right of redemption to be established, daughters could inherit a fief in the absence of a male. For when the Lord gave the fief to the daughter, he multiplied the inheritance of his right of redemption because the husband had to pay it as well as the wife, right? This arrangement could not apply to the crown, for it was not answerable to anyone. There could be no right of redemption for it. In other words, that therefore the right of redemption, they could be handed this. This is why this idea that no woman could this is why no woman could inherit, the argument was. The daughter of William V, Count of Toulouse, did not inherit the county. Latter, Eleanor inherited Aquitaine and Matilda Normandy. And the right of inheritance of daughters in those times seemed so well established that Louis the Young, after the dissolution of his marriage with Eleanor, made no difficulty of returning Guinine to her. As these two examples came very soon after the first, the general law which called women to inherit fiefs must have been introduced later. In other words, must the women to inherit fiefs must have been introduced later into the country of Toulouse than in the other provinces of the kingdom. The majority of the great houses had their particular laws of succession, and this is what Monsieur Taylor tells us in his House of Berry, right? The constitutions of these various kingdoms followed the constitutions of these various kingdoms of Europe followed the actual state of these fiefs when these kingdoms were founded. Women inherit neither the crown of France nor the empire because when the two monarchies were established, women could not inherit fiefs. But women inherited in kingdoms whose establishment was later than that of the perpetuity of thieves, such as those founded by the Norman conquests. In other words, therefore, it's very interesting that in France and Germany, women did not do it because this was the idea that women could not inherit fiefs. But in the countries, in other words, other places uh, that women inherit kingdoms was established was later than the perpetuated thieves, such as the founding of the Norman conquest and those founded by the conquest and made against the Moors, and still others by the boundaries of Germany, and in quite modern times, which were some fashions reborn with the establishment of Christianity, right? There was this idea that you could do this, women work could be done. When fiefs were revocable, they were given to people who were in the position to give service for them. And there was no question about there was no question about minors, right? When I give this to mine, when service it. When they were perpetual, lords took the fief under the one who was to hold the fief come of age, either to increase their profits or to have the ward raised in the exercise of arms. Right? This idea that they would do this in 20. One can see in the Capitoli de Capelas the moment when the kings had their fiefs administered in order to protect them as for minors, an example that was followed by the lords and originated in what we would call the garde noble, the noble guard, right? And I think this is why the fear of this, that whoever took it over like this is why there were trusts emerged. This is in the Norman world, trusts would come to do this, right? This was the custom of called the garde noble, which is P20. This is the guardianship of noble children, right? From it was which is founded on the principles than those of guardianship, and it's just entirely distinct from it. In other words, they would be this, and these are distinct from mere guardianship, and distinct from this. When fiefs were for life, one petitioned for the fief. The real transmission, which was done by the scepter, confirmed the fief as homage does today. We do not see that the counts or even the deputies of kings receive homages in the provinces. That these functions is not found in the commissions of these officers, which have been preserved for us in the capillaries. Indeed, they sometimes made all their vassals swear oaths of fealty. In other words, say something made all of them do fealty. But this oath was scarcely in homage of the same nature as those that are subsequently established. In these, the oaths of fealty was an action joined to the homage, something following and something preceding it, and did not apply in all the homages. It is less solemn than the homage, and is entirely distinct from it. In other words, this is that on chapter 2, this in Onumum cites the charter of old homages, which these differences are to be found. In the great number of authorities can be consulted in the homage, the vassal put his hand on the Lord's and took an oath. The oath of fidelity made by swearing on the gospel. The homage was made on one's knee. The homage was made on one's knee. So therefore, the first one was what? The homage first put the vassal in his hand, his hand in the Lord's hand, take an oath. The homage by the gospel. The homage was made on one's knees. The oath of fealty was taken while standing. So homage on knees, homage standing. Only lords could receive homage, but his officers could take an oath of fealty. Right. So therefore, this is the differences of status in that sense, right? So the counts and the deputies of kings still on occasion made vassals those whose fealty was suspect, given an assurance of what was called a firmata. Right. This is 233. No, this is again the firmata. But this assurance could not have been an homage, because the king gave it to each other. Right. The kings gave this. It's not homage subordinate. A vassal whose fealty was suspect was given assurance of this, but this assurance could not have been because the kings did this to each other. Even if the Abbé Suger speaks of the throne of Dagbert, where, according to the report of antiquity, the kings of France were accustomed to receive homages from the lords. It is clear that he is using here the ideas and the language of his time. He's in other words, he's imposing the words on it of now, back, and then. It's not. This is why he's not good. He's imposing the present on the past. When fiefs pass to heirs, the acknowledgement, la reconnaissance, right, of the vassal, which in earlier times was an occasional thing, became a regular act. Right, the acknowledgement of the vassal became a regular act. It was made in a more striking way. It was filled with more formalities because it was to carry the remembrance of the reciprocal duties of the lord and vassals, pass it down to the ages. So therefore, this was more. In other words, it became formal, symbolized, striking. More what was done irregularly was now done regularly because now this is done to symbolize reciprocal duties of lord and vassals between the ages. It became symbolic. I could believe that homages began to be established in the time of King Pippin, which is when I said many benefices were given in perpetuity. But I would believe it. But I would believe it with reservation, and only on the assumption that the authors of the old annals of the Franks were not ignorant men, who, in describing the ceremonies for the acts of fealty that Tilsan, Duke of Bavaria, made to Pippin, spoke according to the usages they saw practiced at their own time. So therefore, they could do it, but no, these were also fealty. These were, in other words, these were not homage. Maybe it could have been. I could do that, but no, these are not ignorant men. They're describing the acts of fealty of this time, not acts of homage in that sense. Chapter 34, the last chapter of this thing, the continuation of the same subject about fiefs. In other words, it continues the same subject of the consequences of perpetuality of fiefs. When fiefs were revocable for life, they scarcely belonged to any but political laws. This is why civil laws, of those times so little mention is made of the laws of fiefs. But when they became hereditary, they could be given, sold, or given as legacies, and they belong both to political and civil laws. The fief, considered as an obligation to military service, was considered a political right, considered as a kind of good of commerce. It was a concern of civil right because considered as in other words, it was given to military service as political right, and because it was a good of commerce that could be traded or something, it was a good of civil right. This gave rise to the civil. This gave rise to the civil laws on fiefs. As fief became hereditary, laws concerning the order of inheritance had to be relative to the perpetuity of fiefs. This established, in spite of the provisions of the Roman right and the Salic law, this rule of French right, prompt de remonta point. This is property cannot be passed back to a person in a preceding generation. In other words, it can't go back to this principle, this French right, that this property cannot be given back to this. 29. Yeah, this is just the law. The fief had to be served, but a grandfather or an uncle, great uncle, would have been a bad vassal to give to the Lord. In other words, but a grandfather or a great uncle would have been a bad vassal to give the Lord. Thus, from the first, this regulation applied only to the fiefs. That, as we have learned from Book in 1830, right? This is like this only to the fiefs. The fief had become hereditary. The lords who were to see that service was done for fief required that daughters who who were to inherit the fiefs, and I believe sometimes males could not marry without their consent, so that marriage contracts became for the nobles a feudal provision and a civil provision. So therefore, in other words, I'm going to marry someone, and he may be sons of a fief, who had done for service for a fief. Required that daughters who were to inherit a fief, or and I believe even males, had to contract the marriage, because this is the idea that they had to be able to do the service and ensure this, right? And therefore, marriage became for the nobles a feudal provision and a civil provision. In such an act made under the eyes of the Lord, provisions were made for the future inheritance, with a view to the heirs being able to serve the fiefs. Thus, only nobles were at first at liberty to provide for future inheritance by marriage contracts, as Bohler and Ophiel, Ophirius, so Bohler and Ophirius have remarked. It goes without saying that the redemption of one lineage, founded on old right of relatives, which is a mystery of our old French jurisprudence that I do not have time to develop, could have been applied to the fiefs before they came perpetual. Atalimen. I close the treatise of fiefs where most authors begin at. In other words, I close the treatise on fiefs where most of the things begin at. Now, this is interesting. Atalimen. And why is that? This is Virgil, right? This is Virgil in the 3 lines. And he ends it there. And I think this is a thing that, what is that, the Virgil Aeneid 3. I think this is, that's very interesting. Virgil Aeneid 3, I think this is obligation of father to the son, to Italy, to traveling to Italy. Um, from, this Italian. Um, the obligation of the father to the son, right? He's bringing his father on his back, right? Okay, so I mean, this is he's beginning the discussion of feasts where other authors begin it, and this is where we end the book. There's no more ending. We're done. We're done. Finally done. This is probably a 5-hour video. I'm sorry about that, but we're finished. This is the end of the book thing. So therefore, we're concluded. We finished the spirit of the laws. Whew. Now, with this, if you have any comments or criticisms, of course, you can put them down below. If you have any questions or issues, put them down below. Fiefs was this was a long chapter about the changes of the French monarchy and why they changed, why it moved from this original situation where there was hereditary and elective aspects under the earlier kings, and then it only became hereditary, where the German emperor maintained both the elective and non-elective characteristics. In other words, this was very interesting from the understanding of why the difference of this, these things, and why did the French and the emperor, Holy Roman Emperor diverge the way they did, and why the other reigns diverged the way the Spanish and the things diverged the way they did. A very interesting account of this by Montesquieu, and explains the changes of things, both in terms of the French monarchy and all in terms of the French monarchy, right? So any comments, questions, please put them below, and when I see them, I'll answer them. If you liked it, like it. I mean, I'm not sure if people are gonna like this. It's long video. If you didn't like it, you can put it down there and say why in the comments. If you've not subscribed, please subscribe and join us. You can follow me below, both in my social media links, and as you want to know more about me and my academic research, you can see my academic links that are linked below also, like the academic social media. You can, if you want to help what I do, this is very time consuming and energy consuming. As you see, we're going to be turning to Rousseau, social contract. Okay, that's That's in the plans. Um, Please, if you want to help to do that, you can help by helping to contrive on Subscribe Star, Patreon, or other means. You can send money through PayPal or something like this. I don't know. You can it's my email. You can find my email address and say, "Hey, I want to give you some money. A couple, so I can buy something or pay something off." It would be nice. It'd be nice, really. Um, that's the other thing you do. You can buy my books or buy my books below. The books are there below. If you buy by Lulu, I will get more money for the Lulu book than other books. Um, well, that's it. Those are the things you can do. You can help. You can do these things. This ends this on. This will be Thursday, I suspect. On this will end Montesquieu is done. So I guess we'll probably start doing Rousseau, or maybe I'll do something else quickly between the two. So we'll see. But the next major modern book I'll be looking at is Rousseau, Social Contract. On Tuesday, Thursdays, usually at the same time, we'll be finishing Schmidt. So Schmidt's Legitimacy and Legality will be done at this time. Those are Tuesday, Thursdays. I might, maybe I'll keep on this process, or maybe I'll change it. We'll see. Um, and Fridays is usually a live stream or a messing about live stream, or messing about, or just live stream. And that's it. Well, take care and have a good day. Bye bye. I'm sorry it took too long.